It's another ESO video. That's right, another ESO video. See,
I wish I knew how to quit you.
I honestly just wanted another reason to keep playing this game because Dark Secret time, I'm kind of a fan of games like Diablo, and I could take a certain amount of grinding in my games if it leads to something. And I wasn't quite ready to quit the grind in this game because it was going to lead me to being able to solo those fabled veteran dungeons. Plus, well, there's the DLCs, and I haven't even touched the DLCs yet, and I haven't told you, the viewer, anything about them. And I feel like it would be a disservice to you to just ignore that part of the game because by all metrics, and based on what people say about ESO, sometimes the DLCs are the best part of the game. So I will attempt to cover as many of these DLCs as I can cover in a month, and cover them as thoroughly as I can, pointing out the good and the bad of those DLCs, and if the situation calls for it, I'll cover the rest of them in another video. But before that, I gotta address the fart cloud in the room. Before we get into the video, I need to address some criticisms from the last video because they came up often enough that I felt it's important to address them. So I'm gonna summarize the most common criticisms so as to not repeat myself too much. And before I do this, I just want to state that I am not minimizing the validity of your criticisms, but if you feel like I am, then maybe your argument didn't hold any water. And if I come off as sarcastic, just remember, these videos are meant to be entertaining. Try not to get too butthurt when I make your butt hurt because it's the butt of my jokes. So all that is to say, I value your opinions. Now I'm gonna spend 10 minutes telling you why you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. First off, and this is by far the most common complaint, the cheapest house is free and the armory is free. What the hell are you talking about? We're starting off real strong with this one because you are right. That's a mistake on my part. I should have been more specific. There is no grind associated to those two items specifically, although the mechanics of those two items can be argued to be grindy or monetized. You can get a house for free, like I said in the video, and the armory is also free, which is a detail I left out. So sorry about that. The expenses come in when unlocking build slots. It costs 1,500 crowns, or roughly around $10 to $15 to unlock a single armory slot. If you only need 2 slots, hey, that's great. But I like to have more slots for solo builds, DPS builds, PvP builds, and so on. You can consider unlocking slots to be grindy if you consider that you can buy the crowns from people to buy a slot with in-game gold. The conversion rate is usually somewhere around 100 to 1, and I've seen it as high as 2,500 to 1, depending on the buyer. So at the lowest conversion rate, you would need 150,000 gold to unlock 1 slot. So technically I'm correct.
The best kind of correct.
The next common criticism is one form of 2 different weak-ass arguments. You obviously never played any MMOs, or it's an MMO, what did you expect? So let's chop down this tree, shall we? The first argument is very hard to argue against, because how do I prove my bona fides with MMOs in a way that'll be effective? I mean, no matter how many hours I have in MMOs, it won't be enough. Because another common criticism is that I haven't spent enough hours in the game yet to be able to criticize it. Which, if 400 or more hours isn't enough to criticize a piece of media, then holy shit, how does a guy like me, who makes money from making monthly videos, have a life outside of work and still stay on schedule? Because you have to understand that there's an economics problem here that we have to solve every single month. You know what I mean? Like, I can't just go a month without making money. No one can do that, okay? So I gotta solve this economics problem every single month. So if I put like 100 or 200 hours into a game, like with the Baldur's Gate 3 video, when I put over 100 hours into that game and multiple playthroughs, I was taking a risk. I was taking a risk that this video should take off. It's a new game. It's a Baldur's Gate game. All my other Baldur's Gate videos did great. This one will do great too. And it fucking flopped hard. Belly flop from the top fucking diving board flopped, okay? Real bad. And it hurt me that month. So I'm taking a risk whenever I put this many hours into a video, so it really helps me when you guys share the video or when you go to my Patreon and kick me some dollars, because that helps me get through when I make these gigantic freaking videos. Like, really, I should be thanking the patrons profusely every single day, because they make it so that I can make these huge products, these huge projects, and that you get something to watch in the background while you're doing something else that's boring. You know what I mean? So thank them in the comments, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for supporting the channel. Anyway, moving on. So I can't argue against the first, because there's nothing I can really say that is going to make someone believe me when they didn't believe me the first time I said it. And as to the second argument, that I can actually argue against. The answer to this is simple. Just because a genre is designed a certain way does not mean that the genre is better off without innovation in design. A game designed that way is something that we would call copy-pasted gameplay in just about any other game release or any other game genre. So why then are MMOs somehow immune to this criticism? I mean, people are criticizing the new Suicide Squad game for the very same reasons. It's a copy-pasted looter shooter without soul, and Captain Boomerang gets his dick out and tries to pee on a guy. 2 out of 10. So, if you can criticize other games, especially other live service games, for the same thing, why are MMOs the sacred cow? I mean, some of these ideas that keep getting paraded around in MMOs like a pair of socks with holes in the toes are some of the oldest designs in MMOs. For instance, the way tiered loot is done. That's been around since EverQuest and WoW. This trope is worn the hell out like a booty hole of a power bottom. I mean, no sensation, is it in yet, kinda worn out. I can argue against all of this with a story. This story dates all the way back to the golden age of EverQuest. Back before WoW was a thing, EverQuest was in a league of its own, and one of my favorite features of that game was the fact that there were no level requirements on gear, which means that if you could come up with a way to make money, you could be rocking some of the best endgame gear at level 1. I had a racket farming will-o-wisps for an item that sold for 1 gold. I was level 15 monk, and I liked to solo in MMOs, but EverQuest was one of those games where if you tried to solo, you were going to have a hard time leveling. And because death had real consequences aside from experience point loss, it was a risk to wander far from your home city. See, if you died in EverQuest, your course would drop and all of your items in gold would be on your corpse until you went to pick it up. And if you didn't manage to pick it up within 7 days, you were shit out of luck and your gear was lost forever. Let me repeat that. Forever. So there were real, tangible reasons to not go exploring the whole map at level 1, because if you lost all your gear, you were royally buggered. So I had an idea. There was an item, it was a pearl that fit in the palm of your hand that would boost the damage of your monk significantly. But to get that item, I had to go to a high level dungeon and grind it out on some specific mobs. So I shouted for help in local chat and found someone that would be willing to take me there for all the gold that I had been grinding out on will-o-wisps out of the kindness of his heart. So we go there and we're real far away. I mean, we're going through areas with mobs that can one-shot me, sneaking through forests, keeping our eyes peeled for mobs that appeared in the distance, and whenever we get waylaid, the other player would step in and draw the aggro. It was intense and gripping. We traveled on for what felt like a real-world hour, And finally, we arrived at the dungeon. It was a huge tower that held a crypt at the bottom floor. We went inside, and he drew aggro immediately from 3 high-level mobs, and then proceeded to exit the crypt and left me to die. He left me with a message saying, "Be careful who you trust." And my level 15 character was left with no gear and no tangible way to collect my corpse, and now no money. And sure enough, in the future, I was very careful who I trusted, and not only did I form closer relationships with the people that I played than with any other game I have played since, but it also made every adventure with other players that much more tense, because there was always something to lose. It's the last time that trust ever had to factor into a choice to befriend someone in a game. So to answer the question, what do I expect? It's an MMO. Well, the answer to that is fairly simple. I expect something good. Next question. On to the last most common criticism. Level 290 CP is not endgame. You've barely scratched the surface. Alright, well let's look at this in detail. First off, this is clearly wrong. The item cap when levels stop growing in power is 160. As many people in the comments have pointed out, champ levels don't add to much. I disagree, but let's go with the consensus on this one. If the consensus is true that 160 is the cap because items stop growing at that level, then the moment I crossed that threshold and ground out my endgame gear, that's when I stopped meaningfully growing in power. That's when I was able to solo vet dungeons, by the way. That's when I feel like I've reached the end of that particular experience, and everything I am doing from that point on is grinding out for slightly better gear at different rarity tiers. For instance, going from blue to purple to yellow, and the tiny benefits that the gear provides from that point on. If your only metric of whether or not someone has reached the end game is a number which represents how many hours they have spent doing repetitive tasks, then I feel like your judgment is flawed, because I can easily reach level 1000 by doing the same low level, effortlessly easy content ad infinitum without ever being challenged by the true end game content. Not to mention that time spent in a game is only a metric of how boring your life is. Now, there was another criticism that talked about the motifs and styles. It turns out that style books and motif books, they can be found in urns and backpacks and crates. I legit did not know that. As soon as I started looking in them, I found some motif books almost immediately. But just like I said in the video, the racial styles are not what I'm talking about. And those are the only ones I found. I'm talking about the unique styles. The most I have ever gotten are the style pages, and those only unlock styles in the outfit station. But I could be technically wrong on this, so yeah, sorry about that. It might turn out that I find a bunch of motif books now that I'm looking inside of urns and vases and every container I come across. Only time will tell. I'll revisit this at the end of the video if I can remember, and I'll report on whether or not I found any books and style pages by then. Another, and this one is honestly puzzling for many reasons. This critique is my favorite. Many of your complaints are just wrong and stem from you being bad at the game. When asked to elaborate, there is no elaboration or nothing that would sufficiently explain outside of further ad hominem attacks. It's puzzling because I never complained about the game being hard. I did the opposite. I complained that most of the game was too easy. So if someone could comment below and tell me in what way I was bad at the game and how this affected my experience, that would be great. Because I like getting better at my job, and I can't get better without detailed feedback, so I'm going to move on from this. But please, comment below. Tell me how me being bad at the game affected my experience negatively. I really want to know. There was one criticism that I want to highlight because I think it's a fine detail that I left out of that first video, and I would be remiss not to mention it. It's how I didn't mention how you grind out gear and all that entails. Many of the builds I have looked at online use specific gear sets because they add the most to that specific build. The most common I saw was the Briarheart rings and Hunding's Rage. These things are used in a lot of builds. Hunding's is usually pretty easy to get, relatively. You have to unlock at least 6 recipes for each piece of armor, and that can take well over a month of concentrated grinding for mats, and just general waiting for research times to finish and a research slot to open up. This actually took more time than I'm comfortable with because I got a slow start on grinding out levels because I started with heavy armor and changed to cloth halfway through the game. So it took a while to grind out the crafting skills. Don't care, it's okay. The rings are special, and I thought I would focus on them in particular because of how they're dropped. The first barrier to getting these rings is the fact that they're locked behind the Orsinium DLC. I don't consider that to be the bad part. In fact, I really like the DLC, as I will talk about later. But the real barrier is in how they drop. First, we have to talk about something that you may or may not know. If you bind a piece of gear to yourself, that piece of gear has a much lower chance of dropping from the source that they drop from. At least that's what they say online, and I'm not sure I agree with them because my experience was much different. So I went to Orsinium to grind out rings, but I found out, to my dismay, that rings only drop from the chests you get from doing anchors, and that in the Orsinium DLC, they did not have anchors, and therefore, the only way to get the rings and amulet I needed was to grind out the chests that respawn in the area every 10 minutes or so. That means I had to run all over the map in a pattern, looking for hidden chests, hoping they were master level, opening them up, and hoping to God that it has a ring or an amulet inside. Here's the thing. The chests in a given area are not per player. They are shared with the other players in the area. That means if someone is out there doing the same chest run as you, which is likely if those rings and amulets are used in common builds, you'll be looking for chests that don't exist because someone already got to it first. That increases the time it takes to grind out that gear naturally. Then to top it all off, if you don't have a specific skill in the crafting champion skill line that increases the rarity level of loot that drops from chests, you could be like me, spending 2 whole days grinding out chests and never getting even a single item drop that was part of a set, let alone the set that you need. So in order to even grind these rings out efficiently, you have to be a certain CP level to even have a chance to get them. I think it's around level 280, roughly 100 levels above the item cap. So, once I went online and researched all this, it took another 2 days of grinding to find 1 ring and an amulet. Here's the issue. That was about 5 days ago. I haven't found another Briarheart ring because, and I can only go off of what has been said in various forums, but I haven't gotten another ring because I made the mistake of equipping the thing before I got the second drop. Now I have one of 2 choices: to buy the ring for 50k gold or continue grinding out chests and hoping for the best. So if I had another criticism to levy against this game, it would be that it requires far too much reliance on information found outside the game in order to reliably do things in-game efficiently. There's another way to get these to drop, and I wasn't even going to include this at first, but if I don't, then people will mention it in the comments. You can technically get these items to drop from daily missions, but you can only do 1 daily mission a day, and I can't think of a worse way to grind for a low drop rate item in a game than waiting for an entire day to get another chance at getting the item. No thanks, not an option. I wanted to include this story so that I can point out how ESO does grinding. If you need a waist, foot, or unique item, you need to grind out delve bosses. It takes 5 minutes for a boss to respawn. World bosses drop heads, chests, legs, and weapons. and they also respawn every 5 minutes. Public dungeon bosses drop shoulders, hands, weapons, and chests, and world anchors drop jewelry. You have to grind out these specific pieces from those specific activities, each with their own timer. And you know what the real kick in the nuts is? When you finally get the pieces you want, you can find out that it doesn't have the trait you need, which means you could be grinding out for a really long time to find that one specific item you need with that one specific trait you need. And when the item finally drops, find out that the trait isn't the one you need. What a shame. Now, before you type out all you need is a transmute station into a comment, if you don't own the Clockwork DLC, you cannot purchase a transmute station or use the one in Clockwork City. So that isn't an option if you don't own that specific DLC or you don't have ESO Plus. And you can't purchase your own station for your house unless you cough up 1,250 RIT vouchers or open your wallet and part with $40 or 4,500 crowns. Even then, you still have to pay 50 transmute crystals for each transmutation you undergo. So, just like every quality of life feature in this game, there are multiple levels of grind and multiple currencies blocking you off from doing something that would save you an enormous amount of time and sanity. Or you could just open your wallet. There's some more grinding, well, not complaints, but disclaimers. See, I'm pointing all this out to people because I think you should know what you're getting into before you commit to buying it or any of the expansions, especially if you're going to strive for the end game. First, you've got builds. Builds are very much reliant on equipment. Some of this equipment can be gotten from the sources I talked about before, like grinding overworld bosses and delves or dungeons. I needed to get a set that can only be crafted or bought, which no matter how many guild stores I went to, could not find a max level set of. So I was left with only one option. I was going to need to craft it. But to craft armor sets, you need two things. You need to find the crafting benches that specifically make that set, and those are easy enough to find, but the grind comes in when you find out how many traits you need to unlock on each armor piece before you could craft the set. My set required 6 traits. 6 of them! But some sets require up to 9 traits! Mine only required 6, however, but all of it needed to be divines. So not only did I need to get enough armor pieces with the traits I needed, but I needed to wait the amount of time the game requires me to unlock all 6 traits. Getting the armor wasn't hard. I just went to a guild store and purchased a cheap set of armor with the traits that I needed. Cost about 10k gold for about 6 pieces of armor. It took me about a month to unlock everything once I had my crafting fully upgraded, which also took a month of concentrated grinding and lots of crafting scrolls. Yes, I broke down and bought them with the crowns I got from ESO Plus. I'm not happy about it, but I wanted that friggin' set. Without it, I would have needed to wait 10 more days before I could complete my build. And with the fact that I'm working on a video and time is of the essence, combined with the fact that I'm very impatient, well, I'm not gonna lie, they got me. The bastards got me, and trust me, it's how they get a lot of people. The next layer of grinding for gear is the upgrade process. See, when you craft a set, it starts out white. It's not a problem to get your set up to blue, as by this point in the game, you'll have a ton of tannins, and you might even be able to get them up to purple easily as I did. And that's because everything above legendary is 2, 3, and 4 upgrade materials per upgrade. Not too bad, but legendaries go from 4 to 8 in upgrade. It friggin' doubles, unless you have certain champion passives, that is. And that's not the worst part of all this. There's only one good way, in my opinion, to get drag waxes, and that's to farm rubido hide scraps. And I say it took me about 1 hour of concentrated, highly efficient grinding to get about 200 scraps, which is 20 stacks or 20 chances to get drag wax, because that's how it works. It's completely up to RNG whether you get wax or you get elegant lining or embroidery. I averaged it out and I got 1 dreg wax for roughly every 25 to 30 stacks of Rabido I made. One time I grinded out almost 1,000 Rabido hide scraps, went and refined every single one of them, and I only got 1 dreg wax. 1. With my upgrade tree and my skill tree completely upgraded, I only got 1! Okay? So it's completely up to RNG, and sometimes the RNG really screws you over, which means it could take you, if you're lucky as I am, it would take you about 60 hours, maybe even 80 hours to grind out enough wax just to upgrade 1 set of armor, and about 84 hours to grind out enough for all of your armor. That's a lot of mindless shit there, my friends and family. Unless, of course, you do your grinding in a group, in which case it takes a lot less time. Then there's how long it takes to upgrade your weapons. To upgrade your weapons, you could either buy the materials, which can be costly as hell, or you can do what most people do, and that's dailies, which you can only do once a day, and farming material nodes, and hoping to get one from refining those materials. You get a better chance if you take the refining node in a champ tree, and if you've upgraded the passives for the blacksmithing skill line, but it takes a long time to do. And you have to have a really good grind route to do that. And the thing is, unless you're running divines, golding your armor is only going to give you a fairly trivial boost to your power. It's noticeable, but still pretty small. Divines, in my opinion, are the only armor sets that are actually worth golding out, because you get a, like 7 or 9% increase to penetration if you're running the lady. So that's actually kind of worth it, but to upgrade any other type of armor, I don't see a point. It's almost not worth upgrading in most instances. The weapons are the real star of the show, and they give you the biggest boost to DPS, and in my opinion, they are the most time-consuming to gold out per item, of course. Quicker in the fact that there's only 2 that you need to upgrade, but farming nodes to get a chance to get materials that you need is always going to be less efficient than farming hundreds of scraps from bears. And since we're talking about the DLCs here, this video would not be complete without talking about the addition of scrying and excavation. First off, why is this important? Well, unique items or antiquities are very powerful single item sets that can make or break a build. Essentially, you're trying to find these items to complete some aspect of your build, like the healing abilities of the Ring of Pale Order and so on. In order to find these items, you need the Greymoor DLC. So like the jewelry crafting and transmutation, you need a DLC or ESO Plus to access it. Then once you have it, you'll find out that not only do you have a new skill line, which requires skill point investment and grinding to max out, to make the stuff you actually want scryable, you have to do 2 new skill lines. Getting from level 1 to level 5 is fairly easy. You just go to a tiny zone and scry green items there for quick power leveling. But beyond that, you need to go to different zones to scry blues and purples to get to max. To max this out, it's going to take several weeks of concentrated grinding every day for at least an hour each day. Now that doesn't sound too terrible, but trust me, it is. This shit levels so slow. But then you get to the real kicker. At this point, I had all of my clothing crafting maxed and parts of blacksmithing maxed, as well as some skill points invested into jewelry, provisioning, woodworking, and so on. And at this point, I was completely out of skill points. This is where the bullshit comes in, because at some point, while you're putting your build together, you are going to need to go through each area in the game and painstakingly track down every sky shard and grind those bitches to purchase skills in the scrying skill line if you ever hope to get that artifact that you need for your build. Then once you've grinded those out, you'll need to do main story quests and other activities to grind out those skill points. And finally, there are monster sets. These are 2 item sets that have their own grindy mechanic associated with it. There's a helmet and a shoulder piece. The helmet is super easy to get. You usually just do a veteran dungeon, which is really easy, barely an inconvenience, and at the end boss, you'll usually get rewarded with the helmet for that boss. I've almost 100% of the time gotten the helmet to drop on veteran difficulty. Maybe I'm just really lucky, but there you go. The only problem is, there's 3 different flavors of helmet and 9 different traits that the helmet can drop with: light, medium, and heavy. So you could be grinding out the same dungeon for a long time. And if it's a DLC dungeon, good friggin' luck. Just recently I was queued up for Frostvault for an hour and a half before I found a group. The biggest problem I have with this is the fact that if you're doing dungeons and you're doing them for experience, right? Like to get your 100,000 experience point bonus, right? You're usually going to use a scroll of experience on top of that in order to get the most out of that run. And the problem is, you do that, you get queued up for it fairly quickly. It might take a half hour. I've seen it take upwards of a half hour. And then you go to queue up for an Undaunted dungeon, and it takes you an hour and a half to get into it, and by the time you actually get into the dungeon, your experience scroll is completely wasted and has run out. Do you see? It's more than just a problem with the queue times, it's a problem with resources as well. So it's quite a time commitment. So instead of doing groups, I just started soloing Frostvault, and I did pretty good. And I got all the items that I needed without having to wait hours in a line. But that's the thing. If you have to grind out a specific dungeon on veteran difficulty, it could take you forever, because you could be waiting in queue for the same amount of time that you actually have to play the game. So you might not even get into a dungeon before you gotta log out. Then there's how you get the shoulders. This is where the grinding for a monster set slows to a standstill. The only way to get the shoulder is to do the daily missions for the Undaunted. You can do 3 of these a day, but that comes with an asterisk. I'm only able to do 1 of these a day because I have so much other grinding to do that I can only wait in a dungeon queue for an hour a day. So on average, I get 1, maybe 2 of these done a day, and it's all I've got time for. You get 1 key for normal and veteran difficulty, and 2 for veteran hard mode. If you buy one of the coffers from the Undaunted merchant, it will have 1 shoulder piece from any of the dungeons, and that sucks ass. You don't want that. For 5 keys, which will take you a few days if you're solo, you have a chance to get 1 of 2 different dungeon shoulder sets. This means that there's a pool of 6 different shoulders of 2 different sets, which is about a 1 in 6 chance to actually get the piece you want. This means that it could take you several weeks to actually get the piece of armor you need, and again, when you finally get the piece you need, there's a chance it'll drop with the wrong trait. Then you have horse upgrading. You have to do this every day because you can only upgrade 1 stat per day. It could take you the better part of a year to do this if you log in every single day, and it only counts for 1 character. So if you start a new character, you'll have to do this grind all over again. Another level, another layer of daily grind. I mean, if it was just a gold sink, I'd understand. But it's a time sink, just like crafting, and it prevents players from wanting to start a new character when they realize that they need to invest in all these time sinks yet again, or open their wallet. So in order to grind an ESO the most efficient way possible, you need to play every day. Upgrade your horse and try not to forget to do that. And in that day, you need to scry items for an hour a day, grind upgrade materials for an hour a day, do Undaunted dungeons once a day, and do the specific dungeon you need for the monster helmet once a day, and grind the tannin for your weapon at least an hour a day. And if you are still collecting your sets, spend each day grinding out bosses that drop that gear. You might need to play this game 6 hours a day just to get all this grinding out of the way within a month. And if you don't have that many hours a day to grind, then you need to add a month for each hour you lack. If you're normal and can only do 1 or 2 activities a day, it's going to take you about 6 months to get all the stuff you need for you to say that you have finally completed your build and have reached the end game, according to internet contrarians. Of course, you could skip the armor grind, that's true. Not everything needs to be gold, but I think you're getting my point. It's designed to be this way because it keeps you coming back, not because it's fun, but because if you don't log in every day, you'll miss out on all your chores. I'm not necessarily complaining about how much grinding there is in this game. I don't mind the parts where I'm actively doing things to make progress. It's more I hate the things that I have no control over, like artificial timers with a price tag attached. I hate that shit. Like I said before, I like a little grind in my game. Keeps things interesting. I point all this out to posit to you, the guy or gal addicted to grinding. Why does it have to be this time consuming to be fun? Is it fun to do mindless repetitive tasks over and over again, hoping that something random will happen? Or is it more fun to rely on your skill for something to happen? Which one of these two things is more rewarding? Skill-based gameplay rewards or time sink-based rewards? That question's answer depends on how much time you like to sink into a game and what your values are. There's no objective way to say that one is better than the other. If you value your time, then you clearly operate on the side of skill rather than that of time. If you have very little time to spend in games, even more so. If your time is worthless, then you might be more inclined to spend it on one of these kinds of activities. I, for one, can put a real-world number value on my time because the time I spend with games is literally money. And even if it wasn't, I still would not value time sinks because I value the time I have on this earth. And this isn't to say that grind is all bad. Some amount of grind is required to give the player a feeling of accomplishment when they achieve whatever goal they're working towards. But too much grind starts to hollow out that feeling. And the feeling you end up getting from excessive grind is not a feeling of reward, but is instead a feeling of relief. Thank God I don't have to do that anymore. And I have a feeling that a lot of people feel the way I do and would welcome a shift in this dichotomy. A lot of us don't like grinding in our single player games. Why would we like an excessive amount of it in our multiplayer games? What makes grind more valuable in multiplayer games to the player's goals as opposed to the goals of the company? If you start asking those questions like I have, you might start questioning why MMOs are designed the way they are. And believe me, once you start pulling that thread, the whole sweater is going to come undone. The Orsinium DLC is one of the first DLCs to be released for ESO. The first was the Imperial City DLC, and as I stated in the last video, that area is dead. Fun can still be had there, but finding a group to do that content might be difficult. So you might be spending a lot of time fighting mobs, only to get jumped by another random player and lose all your stones. Not to mention the gear that you obtain by grinding out those stones aren't really useful in any of the builds I researched, and frankly, aren't really all that good to me. There are a few sets that were standards in older builds, but they were since nerfed and made redundant. So the situation you have with the Imperial City DLC is that it's a great area, a great idea, with a lot of potential that no one has any reason to go into, so no one does. And a huge and arguably interesting area of the game is now dead because of unnecessary nerfs and the overall neglect by ZeniMax. If the sets were given a boost in usefulness, then so would the area itself. You gotta have a reason to go in there. So all of this is to say that if ZeniMax gave even the smallest amounts of shit about its content that it released in the past, it would add some value to the overall product. But instead, all of the effort seems to be directed at yearly expansions. Now, the Orsinium DLC was the first real DLC that added PvE content, and it has some really good armor sets and weapons that drop there as well. So the value goes far beyond just content. It may be necessary to have this DLC just to complete certain builds, as Briarheart gear is used in some solo stamina builds that I and others use. The DLC comes with the following activities: 2 public dungeons, 17 sky shards, 6 delves, 1 solo arena, 3 crafting set stations, 6 world bosses, and a ton of area quests and side quests. Overall, there's a lot of value in this DLC, and is considered by many to be one of the best DLCs that ZeniMax has released for the game. It isn't without its problems, however. The first and most major problem, at least as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that this DLC doesn't come with a dungeon. In fact, almost every DLC doesn't come with a dungeon. The map has a dungeon in it, and it's marked on your map, but you need to own the Hero Storm DLC to get that dungeon. And while it's fair that this particular dungeon didn't come out until years after Orsinium, I'm more disappointed by the fact that the DLC didn't come with a dungeon or really any meaningful group content aside from world bosses. Technically, the DLC has public dungeons, and those are supposed to be group content, but as with the delves and just about every overland activity, including questing, this content is not difficult enough to justify getting a group to do it. I consider things that can easily be done solo to not be group content. I feel like for content to qualify for that label, it needs to be designed and balanced around groups, like dungeons and vet dungeons are. And for this DLC to not have much in the way of group content is pretty disappointing. Even the Maelstrom Arena is balanced to solo play, and that's something I want to talk about just real quick. The overall lack of meaningful group content in most of the game, let alone the DLCs. The game doesn't really do much to push you into group content with a group, and instead does a lot to push you away from doing group content. Like, I can't express to you how annoying it is to queue up for a vet dungeon, wait over an hour for a specific dungeon, just to have the whole experience ruined by the fact that your tank is a fake tank. Let me explain. A fake tank is a tank without sustain who wears heavy armor and pretends to be a tank, but has no taunts to draw aggro to them, which means bosses will, in the middle of combat, turn on you on a dime and one-shot you before you know what even happened. You end up having to kite the damn thing around the arena until some other poor, unfortunate soul grabs the aggro and ends up having to do the same thing. Now, the solution to this is to form your own groups. True, but the activity finder is there for a reason. It's there to speed up the process and allow people to form groups when their friends or guildmates aren't around. So what ends up happening is people like me, who have stayed away from most guilds because of guild dues and activity requirements, we end up gravitating toward doing everything solo, which takes people out of the activity queue, pushing wait times up. Anyway, I won't ramble on about that here, but all of this is to say, I was disappointed by the lack of group content in general in ESO, and more so with the lack of it in all of the DLCs, including Orsinium. But while we're on the subject of public dungeons, I want to talk about them in more depth here. There's 2 public dungeons, like I said before, and each one is pretty friggin' good. One dungeon has you lighting pyres for Malakath, which is my personal favorite Daedric prince because he's the rawest dude out there. He's a man of simple needs. Someone wrongs you, you wrong that bitch back twice as hard. He's the closest thing that orcs have to a god. And the whole point of this dungeon is to prove to him that you're the baddest bitch in that dungeon. He asks you to light those fires, but he's not going to make it easy. There's a bunch of bosses in here that are sadly pretty simple and easy to take down, but there's also some puzzles here and there to break up the monotony of constant combat, and it's a lot of fun. And these public dungeons feel a lot more like traditional Elder Scrolls dungeons from the single player games in that there's a little more mechanically going on in them. For example, in the second public dungeon, Rekindleth, you meet someone who is looking for one of her group mates, and you enter into a large Dwemer ruin with quite well designed interiors, multiple bosses, some of which could actually be challenging if you're not too high level, and multiple quests. But the main quest has you looking for an ancient evil that turns out to be pretty cool. I'm not going to spoil it here, but the game actually gives you a choice with what to do with him at the end, similar to the choice you make with Mannimarco in the main vanilla quest. But I personally love it when a game does this. Sure, the consequences of your actions aren't meaningful, but the thing about the choice is, even if that choice doesn't affect anything outside that quest, having a choice is an opportunity to roleplay your character. And anytime a game lets me do that, and for that matter, anytime an MMO lets me do that, I'm appreciative of it, because it's the game letting me, in some small way, express myself. And this isn't the only time this happens. There's a ruin in Hrothgar called Paragon's Remembrance, in which you are fighting a violent sect of cultists that worship Trinimac, but in a twisted way that doesn't seem to line up with the tenets of someone known as the Paragon and the Golden Champion. So you go through the level, releasing all of the captives, and you come to a section where you have to choose one life over another. And each person tries to convince you of their importance because they want to live. And it's a great little moment in a game that, frankly, doesn't feel like should have these kinds of moments, and is in stark contrast to the main story of the vanilla game in such a way that a lot of the content in this DLC feels like a totally different game. It's really good stuff. With just the public dungeons, there's about 2 hours worth of content. It doesn't sound like too much, and I'd be inclined to agree, but we'll go into that more when we talk about the delves. For now, let's talk about the other group content, and that's the world bosses. I should explain what they are, since I didn't really talk about them in my base game review. World bosses are exactly what they sound like. They're bosses that you find scattered throughout the world. These are meant for group play, but they can also be done solo as long as you know what you're doing. But trying to solo world bosses poses a very specific issue that is not strictly a world boss problem. The same issue can be found in veteran dungeons. It's like this. World bosses are strong, very tanky mobs that have several attack patterns, and depending on the boss, can also have multiple phases. For instance, Nice-Cleft, a Dwemer Kenturian boss in Hrothgar, has a very simple first phase in which he occasionally swipes at you with a very damaging swiping attack, and a stationary spin attack in which he summons up dwarven spiders and big circles of AoE damage that can really screw you up if you get caught in one. The attack spin cycle does about 14k damage if it hits you, and it isn't just localized to the circle that appears around the Kenturian. It also applies to the circles it spawns in around them. As long as you keep moving, however, you can avoid them, but if you happen to get caught in two overlapping circles, say because they spawned in on top of you, it's an instant one-shot. If you die alone in one of these fights, the boss's health is reset to max, and you gotta do it all over again. But for the most part, this boss is completely manageable solo. But then we come to some of the more, I'd say, unmanageable bosses. Xandadunuz is a boss that not only has a shitty name to pronounce, but I've also seen that people say they're able to solo him. But yeah, man, I don't know. Just look at this screen and tell me if you could tell where his AoEs are coming from. Then you add in suicide scamps at this frequency, and it gets a bit overwhelming. All of this is to say that I understand this is meant to be group content, and that's fine. If I'm not good enough to solo certain bosses, I'll just scream for help in zone chat. But this leads me to the greater issue, one that I'm not too fond of and don't really know what to make of. Meaning, I can't tell if this is a mechanic that should never exist, or if ZeniMax just used it in a bad way. The mechanic in question is one-shotting attacks on bosses in veteran dungeons. Now, I understand why it's there. It forces you to learn the mechanics of the boss before you can beat it. And in groups, that's fine. But some bosses have one-shot mechanics that will snipe someone from across the room or target a random person, and that feels bad, especially when there's not a reasonable way to avoid it. This thankfully rarely happens, but when soloing vet dungeons, it becomes a real problem because some bosses have several mechanics that will one-shot you, some long range, some short, and some AoE. Some with an obvious wind-up tell, and some with a much less obvious tell that seems to come from nowhere. Let's take a boss that most people are familiar with, the Dreg from Fungal Grotto. Now this is not a hard boss. It does, however, on vet difficulty, have two different one-shot mechanics. The AoE is easy to avoid, unless you have a high ping, but the lunging attack, man, I've seen that shit one-shot me when I seem a football field away. Some of this can be contributed to lag, which has killed me in the middle of a boss fight before, but you can usually tell when it's a large lag spike because everything stops, and when it comes back, you're dead. In Orsinium, fighting Celestrix, she has a shout that works in a cone in front of her. If you get hit by it, sometimes you can roll out, sometimes you can't, so the best thing to do is to not get hit by it at all. I remember getting her down to half health, and while dodging out of the way of her attack, I managed to dodge only to get rubber banded back into her cone and killed. It happens more often than you think, and this is the main reason I'm even arguing against its inclusion, because the game is not perfect or precise enough to warrant this kind of precise gameplay. It's the small lag spikes that you can't see that really piss me off, and they seem to come from nowhere. So when you're burning down a boss on autopilot, dodging the right attacks and interrupting the right charges, only to get hit by something you shouldn't have been hit by and immediately die, that shit does not feel good. And I fully understand why these one-shot mechanics are here. They force the player to pay attention to what's going on, so in a way, I'm conflicted. Because I can't say that the game is too easy and then argue about making it easier. That doesn't feel right. In the fight with Celestrix and Orsinium, I managed to solo her with a build that was, well, not optimal, without a companion character. It took forever and several tries to figure out a way to reliably avoid her cone attack, which was to strafe instead of dodge. It just seemed like a more reliable way to do it, and when I finally killed her, I felt relief. I also had an elevated heart rate, and I was sweating like a pig. The satisfaction that I felt having won this fight, man, it was pretty nice. I felt high after managing to do it after so many tries, and I immediately went to Twitter to brag about it. So I can see why one-shots are there, and why some people think they're necessary. But here's the other problem I have with them. When a one-shot mechanic is literally the only reason why a boss is hard, and the rest of the fight is brain dead, I think that's a major problem, because that gets boring. But then you add the high ping, latency, and blocks not working, bashes not firing in time, and other little technical issues. Having one-shots feels real bad, especially when it's objectively not your fault that you die. To me, if you're gonna have one-shots in your game, the game, from a technical standpoint, better be damn near perfect. The other problem I have with this style of gameplay is the fact that when anything is guaranteed, like a one-shot, it narrows down the gameplay possibilities in dealing with that threat. For instance, I have to dodge this attack, I have to bash this charge up, and I have to do it perfectly every single time, or I'm dead. It limits creativity on the part of the player, and I, like I've said before, am not a big fan of this. A forum user by the name of Fenwitty put it best on the ESO forums. They said that there's a difference between a guaranteed one-shot and a probable one-shot. When it's a probable one-shot, there's many answers to that problem. Throw up a defensive shield to absorb the blow, block the attack, roll out of the attack, have the healer throw up a shield, or use a defensive ultimate. But when there's only one answer to each threat, that doesn't test the player's ability to think and adapt. It simply tests their ability to memorize a routine, like rote memorization of a social studies test. It doesn't measure your intelligence, just your ability to memorize something. Now, there's a debate to be had on whether or not rote memorization is fun in a game. I've never heard anybody defend that position without some other form of gatekeeping, like if there's no one-shots, then the game becomes too easy, and so on. I think it can be fun when used in conjunction with other gameplay mechanics that test reflexes, timing, strategy, and improvisation. Especially when you test the team's ability to work together. But simple memorization, well, I think anything can get fun once you get good at it, but once you've memorized something, there's nowhere to go from there. It's a gameplay dead end. There's no way to spice up that encounter with different tactics because only one tactic is available and you've already perfected it. I'll put it another way. If you had the choice between memorizing a boss or finding new ways to deal with old problems, which would you choose? Now, I err on the side of creativity, and that's why I dislike guaranteed one-shot mechanics. All of that is to say that some of the world bosses utilize these one-shot mechanics, and I kinda hate it. But Strat, I hear you saying, no one's forcing you to do these bosses solo, to which I will relent. Yes, you're right, no one's forcing me to do dungeons or world bosses solo, but it's how I have fun. It's how I choose to have fun with this game, and I don't think that the guaranteed one-shot mechanic is any more fun when solo than when I'm in a group. Meaning, seeing my team wipe in slow motion because the boss keeps one-shotting them is no more fun than when it happens to me solo. Here's another way to think about this. Say you're a tank and you're having to dodge certain attacks or bash out others, and you're avoiding all these attacks expertly. You're having a great time because you're directly engaging with the boss in a truly meaningful and exciting way. You are, in essence, the only person in your group that is engaging with the boss on that same meaningful level because you're the tank. And if you're tanking correctly, the threat is always on you and therefore all of the pressure. Which is why when the tank actually does screw up and dies, it's like you gotta watch your whole entire team start to die slowly because nobody knows the mechanics other than the tank, because they never had to actually engage with the boss mechanics before, and now they do under pressure with their most important teammate dead. The DPS is just standing there burning down the boss, refreshing their dots, occasionally moving out of AoEs. The healer is waiting for someone to lose health and managing buff timers, and the tank is the only one actually engaging with the mechanics because they have to. At least if the attacks did not one-shot the tank, the healer could quickly react to the tank's screw-up and save them from their mistake. That way the tank could screw up without dying and give the healer a way to not only be useful, but save the day. In general, having less one-shot mechanics would actually increase the usefulness of most buffs, heals, and player roles because the tank isn't paying with their life every time they get hit. You still have options. Therefore, damage shields have a use, heals have their place, armor buffs have their place. Whereas when the only threat in a fight is a one-shot, it takes away all those options and leaves other players without any meaningful way to contribute other than doing more damage or buffing the other players so they can do more damage. So my point is, why not come up with a more creative way to get your player to pay attention to the fight by having more probable one-shots, meaning attacks that will one-shot most people, but not if they block, throw up a damage shield, or otherwise roll through the attack. Because I think it's better to have gameplay options instead of a one-size-fits-all approach to game design, and have more encounters like the Dwemer spider boss where the players actually have to work together and do certain actions outside of combat in a specific order to prevent the death of the entire team. More coordination, different scenarios like Zerg rushes, chase sequences, anything other than a gauntlet of enemies punctuated by a boss that can one-shot you. Like I said before, I don't know if I would get rid of one-shots. They have their place, and most bosses telegraph their attacks pretty well, with the exception of Celestrix and the ogre boss in Frostfall. They don't telegraph their one-shots at all. I mean, between wind up and attack, there's almost no time to react. So you end up getting in the habit of strafing around the boss instead of doing well-timed dodges because strafing is more reliable than a dodge that can rubber band on you. I'm bringing it up because I always think there is a better way of designing difficulty, and the one screw up and you die kind of difficulty, as far as I'm concerned, is a holdover from coin-operated arcade machines, and I'm not sure that's the best way to design difficulty in an MMO. Again, I don't know why I have to say this, but if I don't, someone is bound to say something about it in the comments. So even though I addressed this all earlier, just because this is a common design trope in MMOs does not make it a good one. This topic is bound to split the audience, as it does in nearly every forum post I've seen discussing this topic. And I think there's a good reason behind that. See, if ZeniMax went with, let's say, 95% hits instead of one-shots, a Templar at high level could simply heal right through it, and in some cases, heal all the way back up to max and barely lose any DPS, resulting in faster clears and less reliance on learning mechanics. That's why I'm a little iffy on the topic of removing one-shots. But let's think about this in another way. Maybe the problem is not one-shots. Maybe the problem is balance, and the power and ability of players to stay alive indefinitely is the reason why only one-shots are challenging. And maybe instead of removing one-shots, we should think about a complete rebalance in power levels so that content can be challenging without relying on insta-death mechanics to make it challenging. I'm not saying it's the way to go. I'm saying it's something to consider. Obviously, that would take a monumental effort on the part of the developers. I'm just saying that maybe there's a fundamental flaw in the core of this game's design that affects everything else and makes balancing the difficulty of the game nearly impossible. Maybe level scaling is screwing you over more than it is helping. And maybe the overbalance of combat to always be set at a specific difficulty, no matter the level, makes it difficult to actually balance combat in a fun but fair way. Remember, one of my main issues with this system is the fact that it's fun to succeed when one screw up could mean death, but it's not fun to die because of a lag spike you can't control. Maybe it's not as simple as removing this feature or that mechanic. Maybe the problem is deeper and is something more systematic. But let's get back on track. Let's talk about the delves. There's plenty of them, 6 in total, but all delves share a pretty similar flaw that is more a problem with the game than a problem with delves. Delves, for the vanilla content, were pretty linear and short experiences, and I tended just to run through them without engaging in the combat because I was only there to kill the boss, grab the sky shard, and move on to the next delve. This happens because, in general, there's not a whole lot of delves that make you want to explore them in depth. Because if you explore them in depth, what are you actually finding that's significant? The main problem I have with delves is they play a lot like the filler dungeons in the single-player Elder Scrolls games. Sure, there might be a story to discover in that delve, but it's threadbare and doesn't inspire the same curiosity that the public dungeons do. They are, obviously, the less well thought out content, and for the most part, the delves are forgettable. Single-serving content that you'll throw away and forget the moment you finish them, and only go back to grind them out for an item you need. And it's unfortunate, because you see a lot of potential for interesting design and encounters in these places, especially when you engage with the ruins and public dungeons. It just feels like some slightly wasted potential there. What I can say about the delves in Orsinium is that they are light years better than the vanilla delves. Way more complex in their design and take a lot longer to complete. So there's something to be said for that. But I want to talk about something that recently occurred to me about what makes exploration fun in just about any game. And I'm going to do this right off the cuff. I didn't really write this. So forgive me if I stumble over my words a little bit, but I recently played through Batman Arkham Asylum, and I got a video coming out for it. I've already written the script for it, but I recently played through Batman Arkham Asylum, and that game has this Riddler system. And in the Riddler system, you discover all these Easter eggs that tell a story behind the story you're already doing. They fill in the backstory of the world, fill out the characters really nicely, give them personality, and there's tapes to discover, Amadeus's Chronicles to discover, so there's always a reason to explore, and your reward for exploring is details about the worlds and the characters in those worlds. So you actually are inspired to explore more so that you can discover more about the world. It's in this way that it's very cohesive and very natural. It's a very natural way that the game encourages your exploration. And this is something that ESO is missing in friggin' spades, because this game does not tell a story with its environments. They're well designed, they look interesting, but there's no stories being told there. So there's no reason to explore at length these places, because you're not going to discover any Easter eggs. You're not going to discover any character background or information. There's no real reason to explore in depth any of these delves. So it really drags the experience of these delves down. I just wanted to say that because it's something that I realized when I was playing Arkham Asylum that I felt like was missing from all this content. You know, a deeper reason to explore any of this stuff, you know? Because every time I play Arkham Asylum, even though I've played it so many times and I've 100% of that game multiple times, I always discover something I didn't realize was there before. That's really interesting, and it keeps you coming back. So when you have these DLCs, they're PvE DLCs, and the only reason that you have to redo that content is to grind out gear, that feels way more hollow than redoing those dungeons because you want to experience them again, because you want to discover stuff you didn't discover before. That actually gives you a more organic reason to go back to that content. So in a game where the content is designed to be done multiple times, the game doesn't give you a reason to do it multiple times other than a shallow reward given to you randomly. So I just wanted to say that. And finally, to close out the review of the activities, let's talk about the arena. It's designed and balanced around solo play, and that's okay. Some people like doing this content solo, but I find it ironic that so many people on my last video were triggered because they thought I was critiquing the game like it were a single player game. I find it ironic because so much of this game's content is designed for solo play. The Maelstrom Arena and the vanilla story content can only be done solo, not to mention the lack of group balancing for Overland and Delve content. There's nothing to encourage you to do group content with a group. And it doesn't help that some of the best DLCs in this game don't come with any meaningful group content. You know what would help? The larger your group, the harder the enemies get, and therefore, the better the loot gets. You know, like Diablo. It would encourage people to group up rather than discourage it, save for a couple of conveniences with certain grind scenarios. But I've harped on enough, and I think that you get the point. The arena sets you up into 9 stages, and each stage, with a few exceptions, has some sort of gimmick that it leverages, so some better than others. So for instance, there's a level that takes place on 3 different ice platforms, and the water surrounding it is damaging. So you have to stay on the ice platforms to avoid death, but then the encounters throw various monsters at you whose only goal in life is to destroy that ice that you're standing on. And if they destroy all the platforms, you die. So you're encouraged to do as much damage to these creatures as possible and focus on them only so that you don't die and have to start over. Then there's a swamp level where the water is periodically electrified, a spider arena where swarms occasionally spawn in, and you have to take refuge in the light of these little standing stones. These are all pretty great because these mechanics are clearly signposted and obvious from a design standpoint. You can literally just glance at things going on in the level and tell immediately what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. But that isn't the case with the 7th arena. There's a couple instant death mechanics in this encounter, and some of them are signposted really well. Like when the boss does his enraged scream, I should have been running up to him and bash him out of it, but I died to that more often than I would like to admit. It's the volatile poison that had me pulling my hair out trying to figure it out. Basically what happens is these little plants pop out of the ground, and if they explode on you, you get infected with volatile poison. And within a certain time frame, they'll explode instantly killing you. This happens on normal difficulty as well as veteran difficulty. Now, I admit that this might be totally my fault for not noticing the little text down there at the bottom of my screen saying, "You have volatile poison." And it does stay up for quite a long time, not to mention the icon stays in your status bar, so there's no reason I couldn't figure out what was happening and why, aside from the fact that I was so focused and tunnel visioned on concentrating on the boss and all the plants exploding around me that I just never saw it, and just assumed there was an attack that was hitting me that I couldn't see coming that was one-shotting me, because so many bosses in this game leverage no-tell one-shots. Regardless of what people say on the forums, they do. I don't care what you say. What I can agree with is the solution to this problem. It isn't signposted very well, because what you're supposed to do is run into these little green circles and they'll cleanse you out of poison, which is great, but I've come to associate green AoEs as healing circles and not necessarily an AoE that will remove a one-shot mechanic from me. All of the other mechanics in every other level are clearly signposted with an object in the level presenting the mechanic, like the pillars you have to destroy in level 8. The early bosses spawn in and can't be destroyed unless you destroy these magical pillars first. This is signposted clearly by being demonstrated on an early boss that probably can't kill you. That way you learn the mechanics without fear of death, and also by the fact that the deactivated pillars are in pieces and there's usually only one that isn't. That way, when we have to use this mechanic on the main boss, when we see there's more than one pillar activated, we already know we have to destroy them before we die and learn through trial and error. That's a really good example of obvious signposting. Level 7, unfortunately, does not signpost very well, and that's a shame, because once I learned the mechanics, it was a damn fine level. Nice and tense, and legitimately had me on the edge of my seat the entire time the first time I played it. And by contrast, the final boss of the area was kind of a pushover in comparison. Overall, I really like this arena and don't have too many complaints. It's a great addition that I've sunk a lot of time into, and the veteran difficulty of the arena is a serious challenge that I've quite enjoyed learning. Now let's talk about the map for Orsinium, because that is one of the highlights of not just the DLC, but damn near the entire game. The map is super varied and broken up into what I can only describe as biomes. There's sections of the map that are reminiscent of a pirate-themed game with boats wrecked against the ivy-strung rocks, the skeletons of dead men guarding their treasure chests. Then there's parts of the map which feel completely different, like the northern section of Hrothgar, snow-laden tundra, ice flows with wrecked galleons, and the undead remains of soldiers guarding the corpses of once great ships. The ruins in this DLC are some of the best sections in the game, and each area has its own personality. It's super good, very creative, and oozes love and care from every orifice. I love this map. I love exploring it, which is good because I've spent a lot of time grinding out treasure chests here. Now on to the main story. It's an interesting subject because it starts off really good, with solid characterization, solid motivations for the supposed villains, and it includes role-playing opportunities not really available in the vanilla game, except sparingly. I won't be spoiling the late or mid-game story, but I will be explaining some of the details of the first 4 missions. If you want to avoid spoilers, hit up the description and change to non-spoiler chapter below. Your mission starts as soon as you enter the map of Hrothgar with a letter that you find laying on the ground next to a dead messenger, who was supposed to come and find you and deliver it, but didn't even make it out of the region before he was killed. How embarrassing. Someone needs a strategy guide for the combat. If you continue down this path, you'll see a group of soldiers held up behind a barricade, sniping some winter-born savages, and once they're done with glorious murder, they'll give you a task. And you'll be seeing this chick a lot in the main campaign, and she's your typical manic pixie girl with a dash of flighty brain for some extra kick. Apparently the Winterborn have ambushed their supply caravan and have taken the supplies, and a chief named Bazrag, which sounds like another name for a cumsock, has run off with his men, his orcs, and is attempting to get his supplies back himself. So you run in, find out the supplies are gone, and that Orsinium has been sold out to the Winterborn by another orc, and all that is pretty typical fare for most game stories. Then you get to the third mission, and it's a mission to raid the Winterborn camp and kill the big baddie. And this is a great mission with multiple objectives and companions to liven things up, and the king is actually a pretty good character. Sure, he's simple, maybe even a little cliche, but he's also chaotic at times and unpredictable, and that unpredictability leads to events like when you have to break into a temple and free some hostages. This is one of my favorite missions in the early game because it felt like it had stakes. Like, if I screw up my stealth and let any of these torchbearers get away, I will have killed a bunch of innocent orcs and fully take the blame for that. And even though it was incredibly easy to do, all without being detected, it was the illusion of depth that fooled me. And it did this because it was a nice break in the formula that ZeniMax typically leverages in these missions, which is a straightforward go here and kill these things type of design. Here, it felt like I actually needed to be somewhat careful, and that's a nice change of pace, even if it was just an illusion. And from there, the king wants to unite all the tribes under his rule, and it was here that I was hoping that the game would have some diverging paths, and it did, just not the way I thought it would. What I was hoping for requires some explanation. Firstly, the divide between these two groups, the king and the wild tribes of orcs, is widening because the king and his kingdom worship an old Aldmeri Aedroth named Trinimac. He's the guy that people thought was super cool before they discovered Malakath. It's rumored that Boethia ate Trinimac, and the orcs were born from that somehow. Like, did she poop orcs out? Are orcs poop babies? That difference in gods is where this rift is forming between the worshippers of Malakath, the wild tribes, and their traditional ways, and the worshippers of Trinimac and the new Orsinium kingdom. I was hoping that at this point that the game would diverge into different paths, side with the Malakath orcs or side with the king, because I'm partial to Malakath. I think he's a rather cool dude, and I think that when you're presenting two sides of an argument in an RPG, you should let the player decide which side of that argument they're on, because one of the public dungeons has you interacting with Malakath, doing favors for him, and it creates a bond between the player and this fictional character, only to have you actively forced to work against him in the main story. If you liked Malakath, it feels like you're being forced to betray him, and that feels bad. It feels like a missed opportunity, blah blah blah, moving on. From this point on, however, the missions have varying levels of quality, but none that can be considered bad. A lot of them have choices that change the story somewhat, and I really like that addition to ESO, and I hope it's a trend that I see in other DLCs and not a one-time fluke. But after the most obvious twists in the game is revealed, the rest of the main story kind of plays out in a predictable way, and there's oddly no choice in the end, when there is obviously an incredibly important choice that happens in the end without your input or intervention. And it sort of falls a little flat despite what the endgame dramatics might be trying to convince you is there. Overall, I like the main story, and it's quite a step up from the vanilla storyline and its twisty, nonsensical logical leaps. After completing most, if not all, of the important content in the expansion, I would say that I'm very satisfied with my purchase, and I would recommend this expansion to anyone interested in expanding their journey beyond the vanilla content. If I had to put an arbitrary number on it, I would say this is a solid 8 out of 10. Closer to a 9, to be honest, and I'd say it's a must pick. Morrowind. Now this is the expansion that I was looking forward to playing the most, because I've actually played it before on console, but never on PC. Not that there's much of a difference, but it's been a while since I played it, and I don't remember much about the story, because, well, it's frankly pretty friggin' short, and I'm looking forward to playing it again to refresh my memory, because it's strange that I don't remember much about it. But before we go talking about this expansion and what it does well, let's talk about some of the questions I have about the setting. According to some accounts, this entire game takes place about 300 years before Dagoth awoke and caused Red Mountain to erupt, letting loose the plague which would eventually lead to the events of TES3 Morrowind. but the accounting from ZeniMax says that it takes place 800 years before Morrowind, so we're going to go with that account. So all of this is happening at least a half dozen or so 100 years after the Nerevar was murdered and the Chimer were changed into the Dunmer. So my question is, why is Balmorra actually larger than it was in a game that takes place much later in history? Yes, technically it's smaller, but not when you take into account the scale of the city. Look at these walls. They're way bigger than the walls in TES3, and not to mention, there's more walls separating each district, and not just more walls, more little details like fountains, the fact that the temple is no longer out on a little hill by itself, but instead, the whole city seems to have been built around it. The waterway that runs through Balmorra is large enough to fit ships through now, which means that even the small river is larger in the past than it is in the future, which makes sense, but not when you take into account that in order to shorten that waterway, the walls surrounding the river would have been needed to be knocked down and rebuilt. Then we need to talk about scale. In TES3, Balmorra was surrounded by mountains, and Balmorra was nestled inside it in a valley with a little river flowing through it. Logistically and realistically, a city over time does not shrink. It will grow, especially given the fact that the Empire was eventually permitted to move in and start settlements. But you see, Balmorra couldn't really grow outward because, as I said previously, it was closed in by mountains on all sides. It could have expanded out by the gates, but not by much. And the ESO version of Balmorra is also enclosed by mountains on all sides. In fact, not only is it enclosed by mountains, but right on the other side of the mountain is the Dwemer ruins. The space where the Moonmoth Fort is supposed to be is just gone, and instead, we get the path between the mountains that was on the other side of the fort. We get this because the map of Morrowind in ESO is significantly smaller than the map in a single-player game. This is honestly to be expected, but here's where I start to have problems. In the future, 800 or so years after the events of ESO, Balmorra will expand out. But there's clearly nowhere for Balmorra to expand to in ESO, which means that Balmorra would have to grow up, not out, in TS3, but instead it doesn't, it grows out. It seems like a small thing, and it is. I can easily just discard it, but it is one in a series of kinks in the chain that is ESO's world building. It's one of the things that when I noticed it, I kind of stopped and said, oh, so we're just ignoring the lore to make things look pretty. And it does look pretty. There's a better sense of scale in this version of Balmorra, and overall it is better designed and much nicer to look at than the TS3 version, but like I said, you have to ignore the lore of previous titles to be immersed in this one, and that's pretty hard for someone like me who claims to like Morrowind more than just about any other game he's played. In other words, it's really hard to fool me. But what is even more puzzling is the fact that other cities that would not exist are missing rightfully from ESO. So they obviously cared about world building and lore, except when it impacts how the game looks. But then they go and break the lore in other small ways, but ways that would be easy to retcon and explain away. Like with Seyda-Neen. Seyda-Neen is apparently under the control of House Halalu, which is a major power at this time in the Elder Scrolls lore, and control much of the south. So why then does Seyda-Neen look like an imperial town with imperial architecture, with lumber walls, stonework, and thatched roofs? Keep in mind that up to this point, the Dunmer have only sided with the Nords and Argonians for the Ebonheart Pact. That does not mean they were allowed to settle in Morrowind. Also, more food for thought, during the end of the First Era, the Empire tried to invade Morrowind, and the Emperor was assassinated by the Morag Tong for his efforts. The Empire was then banished from Morrowind because of this. Now, some people think that because trade had increased in Morrowind, that Seyda-Neen was then co-opted by foreigners to take advantage of the money flowing in and out of the port at Seyda-Neen. But that would mean that the racial makeup of the city would likely be pretty diverse, like what we see in TES3, right? And it is, for the most part. Mostly orcs and Argonians, which makes sense given the Alliance War, Wood Elves, and Imperials? Now that's really odd, given that they're at war with one another. If you talk to the Imperial, you actually get to ask her what she's doing here, and she tells you that she's here to escape the war in Cyrodiil, and she's allowed to be here because of the Shared Borders Agreement. I have just a couple of questions about this, and maybe this is covered somewhere in the lore, but why would a country, in the time of war, allow an open borders agreement with countries and peoples they are currently at war with? Do you know the kind of trouble that would cause with guerrilla fighters, spies, terrorists, that kind of thing? I mean, letting wood elves into your country when you're at war with them seems kind of dumb, don't you think? I mean, especially given the Dark Elves' way of governance and their society and the way they think. These guys are slavers. These guys are warlike. These guys are tough. They believe in survival of the fittest, and they have kicked all foreigners out of their country. Not to mention the fact that I just got done saying that they had just kicked the Empire out of their country because they tried to invade them. Why would they then agree to an open borders agreement with the very same people that they just kicked out? I have a hard time believing they would swallow this treaty the way that they did. So anyway, back to Seyda-Neen. I guess you can make an argument for why it's imperial looking, even though there's only one Imperial living there, and the rest are races from the Ebonheart Pact. Maybe this was set up back before the Imperials were banished, and it has stayed exactly the same, not only since then, but also 800 years later than that. I mean, Seyda-Neen in ESO looks almost identical to Seyda-Neen in TES3. I guess I can stretch my imagination and force myself to believe it, but since I'm stretching to believe it, it's therefore taking me out of the experience. It is the opposite of immersive. Personally, it doesn't feel like they made the decision to make it look the way it does for any logical reasons, other than, well, this is an iconic place. You start off the events of TES3 here, so let's keep it the same and we can bank on the nostalgia that it'll make people feel. Then there's the small details that this expansion both gets right and wrong at the same time. Aldrun, it's small, very rural, just a big mud crab shell at the back of town, surrounded by Ashlander yurts. Awesome. Makes a lot of sense that it wouldn't be too built up at this point, and shows the progression of the settlement between the two game periods better than any other town in the game. But, like I said, it's not about how shit looks, it's about the small details. Remember when Morrowind went out of its way to develop the Ashlander culture, and two of those details were about customs? You know, never enter a yurt without permission and always bring a gift as a sign of respect. Well, all that shit's right out the window. You can enter yurts willy-nilly, no one will say anything to you, and the ones that have a door that you have to enter are unenterable unless you have a mission that allows you inside of them. And that unenterable building thing, that's something I want to touch on. I think it's pretty dumb for a game with the Elder Scrolls name on it to have this many unenterable buildings in it. You see these things everywhere in towns where the door is inexplicably padlocked or otherwise unenterable, with only a line of text explaining that you cannot enter the building at this time. In an Elder Scrolls game where the whole point of the game is exploration, you are cutting off this very important thing in order to avoid what exactly? Like, what exactly is the point in blocking me from entering Scar, the big mud crab shell? It just feels like an artificial limit is what I'm saying. Like the game artificially limiting what buildings you can go into and what people you can interact with and at what time you can interact with them. And they're doing that because they don't want to go through either the extra effort of modeling every interior and populating them with interesting NPCs, or they want to tightly control what content you could do and at what time, right? But this is the antithesis of Elder Scrolls design. Like, Elder Scrolls games are literally games that do not gatekeep you at any time. They let you go anywhere and do anything you want. Like, even with like character creation, the system is wide open, and that's usually where the most rules are put into place in most RPGs to prevent you from doing weird and wacky shit with your character, you know? But this is the game series that coined that famous term, see that mountain over there? You can fuck it. Is there a good in-game logic reason for it? No. Just you can't go in there unless you have the quest to go in there. Same goes for dungeons you might find in the wilderness. In a good Elder Scrolls game, if you find a place out there in the wilderness, you're able to enter it about 99% of the time, and not only enter it, but explore it freely. But here, not so much. In fact, there's no point in going up to about 50% of the dungeon entrances because there'll either be pillars that you could take a rubbing from, or there'll be a door that you can't enter. Or it'll be a door that you can enter, but will contain an event you can't participate in because you don't have the quest to do that yet. So instead of just going out into the wilderness to explore and see what you find, you're supposed to find quests that lead you to the thing you could have found on your own. It's a small change, but it's one that has effects that ripple throughout the game. I only bring it up because this game did away with completely level requirements for zones so that players could explore those zones with a level of freedom not usually found in MMOs. The choice to do that affected the difficulty of the game, their ability to balance that difficulty, the pacing of the game, and many other small things, which made ESO feel like a totally different experience. And all of that was in service to freedom that the game still manages to undermine. Now, even if I was just to disregard the unenterable doors and chalk it up to a limitation with the engine, which it's not, or a limitation with quest scripting, or some other explanation, that would be fine. But then there's the buildings that you can enter. 90% of these buildings will either be empty or filled with NPCs that you cannot engage with on any meaningful level, or even have a conversation with. Not even a single line of dialogue. You know what I actually like about the encounter with the Imperial and Satanine? I like the fact that she was able to lend some modicum of believability to a situation that I was doubting heavily, and contributed in a small way to the world building. So when 90% of the buildings you enter into in this game are either empty or contain no meaningful interactions, and the other 90% are people wandering around the city that can't be interacted with, and the rest have no meaningful dialogue, the world building feels weak. Like, it feels like this expansion pack, more than any other expansion, depends on the previous games to build its world for it. I mean, it's so confounding. They built all these cities and actually cared to make them believable spaces, but then didn't care to fill them up with anything besides quest givers and merchants. Towns in an RPG are places to refill your stock of supplies, sure, buy and sell things, get quests, but these are all things that ESO towns fulfill. But they're also places that tell stories outside of objectives. Places to discover the personality of the world and its inhabitants, and learn about its customs, its taboos, its laws, their culture, and their superstitions. All of this connective tissue is completely missing. And the first time I noticed it was missing was when I got to this expansion, because I have contrasting material to compare it against. The OG Morrowind had deep lore and world building, and by seeing these two experiences side by side, it becomes more difficult to appreciate the one while the other still exists. Now, all the other stuff I talked about, well, we can argue in the comments about that shit all day, and I'm sure there's probably a lore explanation somewhere that explains all of my complaints, because it's really easy to retcon instead of adhere to previously established lore. It's very easy to retcon things, but then you've got issues that are a little more obvious, like the expansion's main story. Here's the deal. Something or someone is futzing around with Lord Vivek's power, and it's starting to wane. The threat here is that Bardau, the big rock that Vivek is holding aloft over Vivek City, is going to fall if he loses too much of his power, and this would destroy the city and take most, if not all of Morrowind with it. That would be a huge blow to the Ebonheart Pack and the Dark Elves. But here's the thing. Just like the problems I mentioned with the world building, TES3 exists. And since ESO takes place before the events at Red Mountain, we know that this rock is not gonna fall. So there's no stakes, no threat, no tension, nothing pushing us to know more aside from simple curiosity. Just this series of events that lead to a very unsatisfying ending that we all know is coming because the other games exist. That is a huge problem, considering you have two of the most recognizable characters in all of Morrowind setting off the events of the story. Here's how the story gets started. You'll be traveling from Say to Neen and most likely run across a quest marker, and some people huddled over the body of an armiger. Then a person possessed by Azura says this.
Tizer, what's wrong? Someone help!
Why, the three! First a wounded armiger, now this!
By dawn and dusk, evil creeps through the shadows of my beloved Vardenfell. But an outlander arrives to aid my people, just as I have foreseen.
The main quest has you directly interacting with Vivek, and the main story is actually really well written, but not always. When you meet the possessed girl, she says this.
Lord Vivek, protect me. That was Azura, the queen of the night sky. And you, she spoke directly to you, Outlander. I'm surprised the Daedric Prince would risk Lord Vivek's wrath to proclaim a prophecy.
She's surprised that Azura would risk Lord Vivek's wrath because the common belief in Morrowind is that Lord Vivek is a living god, and much more powerful than the Daedric princes. They could be considered gods depending on how you look at it. I'm sure that the people who worship the Daedra think of them as gods, but the general consensus in the world of Tamriel and Mundus is that these are not gods, only the 9 divines are. If you've played OG Morrowind, then you know that Vivek isn't a god, and therefore know where his power comes from. But the average person on the street in Morrowind doesn't, especially a temple priest. So the fact that she worries for the safety of a Daedric prince is funny to those that are familiar with the story and interesting to those not familiar to the story. And some people like to say that the Tribunal are actually more powerful than the Daedra because there's been 2 occasions where the Tribunal has stood up to the Daedra and won, but I'm fairly sure that both of those fights took place in Mundus, where the Daedra are significantly weaker and don't have access to all their powers, like they would in the Plane of Oblivion, right? But all that's to say that to the uninitiated, they won't know all this, and it works because it sets up Vivek as a very powerful being. So when you finally meet him, there's a bit of awe involved. Then she says this in response if you ask her if Azura and Vivek don't get along.
What do they teach you where you come from? Lord Vivek's a living god. Azura is merely the anticipation of Sothasil.
The priestess is referring to a book from the OG game called The Anticipation. In it are all forms of blasphemy against the Daedra, who the Dunmer, formerly the Chimer, worshipped as gods. And in the Anticipations, it's stated that the Daedra did not deserve this form of veneration, for they harmed their people as much as they helped. This is exactly what we see with Meridia in the vanilla campaign, and it is one of the key things about the Daedric personality is that they are dual purpose, good and bad. They sort of blur the lines. Meridia is a godlike being that wishes for nothing more than veneration and believes that mortals should be thankful for her help even when it harms them, because they should be happy that she has deigned to descend from on high to help them at all. This is how the Dunmer people began to look at the Daedra after the rise of the Tribunal and believe that the princes were subservient to the living gods of Sothasil, Almalexia, and Vivek. Now they believe that Azura, for example, is the god before the real god, Sothasil. And with the rise of the Tribunal, their power is not only waning, but is obsolete. Now we all know the truth, of course, but it's a nice little piece of lore baked right into the dialogue. But, like everything else, it's depending on your knowledge of the previous game to extrapolate any of that meaning from the available text in ESO. Without ES3, that meaning is completely lost to the player because from my research and playtime, the Anticipations is not in the list of books available in ESO, and even if it is, the backstory isn't explained in the expansion because it isn't even relevant to the events happening in Morrowind at the time. So this just seems like a bunch of mumbo jumbo to your average non-Morrowind playing player. In other words, all that rich lore from the previous games isn't found here because the books hadn't been written yet at that point in history, or it's an oversight. Either way, it doesn't feel like the lore in ESO can stand on its own without the other games and makes it less of a self-contained experience than I would like. And I should probably say this, none of this is a deal breaker for me. I don't consider this expansion bad because it lacks things that other games had. What I'm saying is that I can't ignore the bias I have for another game when this one is objectively inferior in so many ways when compared to the best game that has ever been made. I don't give a shit, bitch, fight me. So anyway, the main story is, and I should probably put a spoiler warning here because I'm just going to go ahead and spoil the whole thing because honestly it's a very short story and there's not a whole lot to talk about except when there is, and I really need to talk about the ending. So skip ahead if you want to avoid spoilers. So anyway, you meet Azura, which is honestly really cool. I like her voice and the way she's presented. And later you get a chance to ask her some questions, and I really like her answers. See, what's happening here is that Vivek is weakened, and no one knows why. It turns out that the reason he's weakening is because someone stole and repurposed the tool that Sotha-Sil made to study his own divine energy. He did this by siphoning out a portion of his energy with the tool. Now the tool has been fashioned into a staff, and this staff is being used to siphon out the power of Vivek. The staff is being wielded by a Nerevarine hopeful, Chodola, and because of this, we interact with the failed incarnates, see Azura again, and there's a really cool scene in the main story where you have to present the failed incarnate stories as the reason why Chodola's claim to power led the other incarnates' downfalls. And in the end, his inability to listen to reasonable advice is the reason the wise woman doesn't name him the Nerevarine. Then as the story progresses, Vivek gets more sick to the point where his soul leaves his body. And because he's so weak, he's losing the ability to keep the moon rock from falling, which provides some of the coolest spectacle in the game, showing just how much of a threat Baldar is. The whole thing ends with a twist that I saw coming, even though I didn't know who was behind it, and honestly, I think this is a bit of character assassination, and a lazy one at that. See, Clavicus Vile, the true prince of schemes, the dealer, the Daedric prince of regret, the allegory for Satan, this is one of my favorite, if not most underused princes in all of Elder Scrolls lore. I love this guy. Barbas is a Daedra who takes the form of a dog, and he never leaves his master's side, unless his master is like, get the hell away from me, but he is bound to Clavicus. Some lore introduced in ESO point to Barbas as being a portion of Clavicus cut off and formed into a being. He is likened to Aedra in that way, that he creates and shares his power instead of hoarding his power like most Aedra do. But the character assassination comes with, well, the entire plot of the Morrowind expansion. Barbas is often portrayed as the white to Clavicus Vile's black, the yin to yang. They are, in other words, two sides of the same coin, which is why most believe that these are not two different people, but instead two aspects of the same Daedric prince. He is often the voice of reason that talks Clavicus down from the precipice. The entire plot of the expansion is that Barbas has stolen Vivek's power and is plotting to see the total destruction of Morrowind and parts of Vardenfell, and he's doing this, and get this, to curry favor with his master. My problem is, this is not something that Barbas would do. according to his past lore, of course. But instead, it might be a scheme that Clavicus would hatch, and in the end, Barbas would likely seek you out to stop his master in some way. Even though Clavicus is Barbas's master, there is no evidence that they are bound in any way. In Skyrim, for example, Clavicus sends Barbas away, and this greatly weakens Clavicus, leaving him stranded in his shrines, unable to move about. Clavicus wants an end to the civil war. He says that if he had the power to, he would simply snap his fingers and everyone in Skyrim would die. Problem solved. He's a real asshole. At some point, the option to kill Barbas comes, and if you refuse, Barbas thanks you and tells you that since you trusted him, he'll trust you and work to make his master see the light, so to speak. In fact, when you meet Barbas for the first time, he'll tell you not to accept any deal that his master offers you because he's looking out for you. Does that sound like the actions of someone who's willing to murder an entire island's worth of people just to please his master? In any of that, did it sound like Barbas is a frickin' bootlicker? In Skyrim, he's working to undermine his master. The whole reason this quest even happens is because Barbas got into a heated argument with his master. So the idea that Barbas would do all this stuff and damn near destroy Vardenfell all to curry favor with his master is, well, a bit out of place for the character, to say the least. He seems less like the partner and voice of reason and more like a mindless cultist willing to do anything for his master. Sorry, but I don't like it. 2 out of 10 would not bang. So when you get to the end, kill Chodola and get the staff, it turns out that the archcanon is, it's Barbas! And he's working to free all the mechanical abominations from the Clockwork City to further wreak havoc in Nirn. Again, what? And at the end, you get trapped in a room with a statue of Clavicus, and he tells you that you'll be trapped with him for a few decades as punishment for your meddling. Now, there was an opportunity for Barbas to save his character here by interceding on your behalf and convincing the prince to let you go. And Barbas could even tell you that he was forced to do what he did and he was glad that you stopped him, and even that he let you stop him. That would have been infinitely better. There was an opportunity to save this character, and instead they just let you get teleported out using the MacGuffin by some other guy. Super lame. Overall, while there is a bit of spectacle, and there were times where I said out loud, this is super cool, I was overall very underwhelmed by the story. Not just because it's so short, though that is a very large reason for it, but because they kind of screwed up the world building and lore again. They fumbled the ball again. How do you keep doing this, ZeniMax? I hate to belabor this point, but look at it this way. Clavicus Vile took the good parts of himself, the parts that cared about people, the compassionate side, and he cut it away from himself, believing that those parts of him are not really him, but something separate. He did this so that he could delight in the torment of others without feeling guilty because he had become dissatisfied with immortality, bored, so to speak. But Barbas didn't go anywhere. He's still there, always at Clavicus's side, whispering morals into the prince's ear. This is why he sent his conscience away in Skyrim. He wanted to have fun, and Barbas was getting away of that fun by reminding him of his compassionate side, his reasonable side, the side of himself that he tried to discard. So, if Barbas is just a mindless asshole seeking the death of thousands of people just to please his master, in what way is he a reflection of Clavicus Vile? ESO turns this dynamic relationship from dynamic to a simple master-slave narrative, which isn't as interesting as a boy and his dog, where the dog is just as important and powerful as the master, and neither could do without the other. That's a hell of a dynamic. And ESO, since it's canon, totally ruins that. I hate it, thanks. In fact, to even further drive this point home, there's another quest in ESO where they actually get Barbas right, in that Clavicus makes a deal with the guy. The deal goes wrong, and Barbas contacts the player to help him set things right. Does that sound like the actions of a guy who blindly follows his master's orders? There are some, however, that believe that this is within character. They say this because at the end of the day, Barbas is a part of Clavicus and he'll do whatever is in the best interest of Vile. But this is the thing that this attitude doesn't take into account. Part of what makes the Daedra so interesting is their dual natures. These Daedra are rarely ever just straight up evil. Mehrunes Dagon, for instance, is the Prince of Destruction. He's also the Prince of Mortal Ambition, and ambition can lead to change, both good and bad. Molag Bal is probably the only prince that is just a straight up asshole. Everything about him is horrible. But even Vermina is the prince of both dreams and nightmares. The more interesting princes always have this side to their nature, which lends believability that there would be people who worship them, whereas Molag Bal would only be worshipped by some of the worst people in the realm, which makes him the perfect villain. My point is, the thing that makes Vile interesting is not that he's a metaphor for the devil. Okay, sorry, that's the least interesting thing about him. What is most interesting about him is the constant fight he is in with his better natures, and without that struggle, he's just another asshole. Okay, I'm forgetting Namira, but then again, so did most of you. To take this one step further and convince you that I am right, have always been right, and will always be right, so help me God, let me provide another example of how the duality of these princes is so important. Sheogorath. Strat, you're thinking. Sheogorath only has one side, and that side is Crazy Train. He's like a coquette Ozzy Osbourne, which is redundant. How is that dual nature? Well, sir and or madam, you have just, as the kids like to say, played yourself. Jigalag is the Daedric Prince of Order. This is an interesting dude with an interesting concept and origin. He believes in determinism because he can see all events, past and future, all at the same time, and because of this, he believes in concepts like individuality to just be illusions that the mind creates to deal with the fact that no matter how much you struggle, your future is unchanging. Now, what does this have to do with Sheogorath? Well, he is Sheogorath. He is what the Daedric Prince used to be before the other princes cursed him with madness to curtail his power, as they became afraid that he would become so powerful as to do away with the other princes and spread absolute order throughout Nirn. His desire is to spread order, and his punishment is to be cursed with chaos. In other words, the essence of tragedy. He is only allowed to return to his original form, Jigalag, once at the end of each era in an event that is known as the Grey March. He emerges, spreads order throughout his realm, only to be forced to turn back into Sheogorath, changing the realm back into gibbering madness. Now, what is interesting about this relationship? Is it the fact that Sheogorath is a gibbering madman? Or is it the fact that he's actually the god of order cursed to be a madman for most of eternity, only to get a taste of his freedom and have it snatched away from him just as quickly? It actually makes you feel sorry for this crazy asshole. What is interesting about Sisyphus? Is it the fact that he's cursed to spend eternity pushing the boulder uphill? Or is it the fact that once it falls down the hill, he'll go back down the hill and try again, even though he's doomed to repeat this mistaken quest forever, and he'll never get that rock up there? Or is it all of the above? Or is it the fact that his story tells us something about human nature, and the fact that the path to happiness is acceptance of the things you can't change? I think it's interesting because it tells us something about ourselves. It's a human story. Just like someone numbing the caring side of themselves so they don't have to feel bad about the awful things they choose or are forced to do. It's something people do, therefore, we can relate to it. There's another argument in favor of this character change, and that is the canon of the future is not solidified in the past. Therefore, the origins of the character can be anything, so long as it's possible that they could have started that way. It's basically a complicated way of saying that nothing is set in stone and you can change a character any way you want. And in a way, I guess this can be like a character arc. You know, a character starts one way and ends up another way. The issue is, this isn't what happens. We don't find out that Barbas has changed in this story. He starts off the same way he ends because we don't get to talk to him at the end. Just like the other background lore in the game, ESO leans on the previous games to inform the characters in this game's arc. There is no arc, therefore no depth. I'm not saying that you can never change a character's actions. Anything is possible with any character so long as there is a believable reason why they are contradicting their established moral guidelines. The problem is, this story gives us no reason why he's doing this other than the motive to make his master happy, which misunderstands the relationship between Barbas and Clavicus, but also contradicting everything we have previously established about the character. Barbas has been set up to be the foil to his master's plans, and instead, this story makes him an accomplice. The question I have is, did this change add any depth to the character? Or did it take away depth for convenience of story? Could it have been done in any other way? And would it have been better off if it had been done another way? Did you have to undermine the character for sake of convenience? I feel like the trade-off wasn't worth it. And that this change to the character not only didn't add depth, but instead took depth away. As I pointed out before, it could have been done with slight changes, while adhering to previously established character traits. Characters that don't adhere to their own moral codes are boring for one main reason. It's the same reason why chaotic neutral characters are fun for a time, but start to become annoying as the story progresses, if they don't have established guidelines or lines that they won't cross. If you can't assign motive to a character, you can never predict what they're gonna do. It goes from unpredictability to being predictably unpredictable. And oddly enough, you start to be able to tell what the character's going to do by virtue of what a normal person wouldn't do. They eventually fall flat as characters. If you take away the dual nature of Vile, all you are left with is an asshole who would only have other assholes as company. No one wants to have a sycophant as eternal company, and no one wants to be surrounded by people just like themselves. Sorry, one of me is enough to put up with, thank you very much. Now let's move on to the content. We'll start with the environmental design. In a few words, I love it. It retains a lot of the charm of ES3 while putting its own somewhat believable twist on how the island would look in that time period. I don't have much to say other than it's pretty awesome, but it does feel a bit small, but that's because I'm comparing it to what I've seen previously, and perhaps that's not fair. There are 6 delves, and each of the delves have varying levels of quality. Some are pretty straightforward, and some have these massive open areas that make exploration a fun experience, even though there's not a whole lot to see other than a couple of chests, a boss, and a sky shard. Overall, I don't have much to complain about, but as a general statement, only one delve stood out enough to me to the point where I remembered it as I was writing this, and the rest were pretty forgettable. And the quests associated with those delves are also pretty standard fare. Go in, find a person, place, or thing, and come back. There's not a whole lot of twisting and turning in these quests, and therefore they weren't very memorable either. There's 2 public dungeons, and these, again, are pretty decent, but nowhere near the level of fun that I had with the Orsinium expansion. Those were a ton of fun, and these dungeons just can't compete with that level of quality in my opinion. The quests were decent, but again, nothing that really stands out like with Orsinium. But these dungeons do have one thing going for them, and that's how complex and interesting the dungeon design and layouts are. I always felt like there were a ton of side passages to explore, alternate routes, and the scale of some of these places is pretty impressive. Like the Dwemer dungeon with Naramo. That dungeon was visually interesting and a joy to explore. The second dungeon starts off sort of bland, but then opens up into a wide open area and becomes much more interesting to explore and make your way through. And again, this dungeon has a great sense of scale that it just makes you stop and admire it before getting back in there and killing fodder enemies. So you might start seeing a pattern here. We've looked at 2 expansions, and each one had 6 delves, 2 public dungeons, and 6 world bosses. This seems pretty consistent as a pattern, so in the future, if an expansion has any more or less, I will be sure to bring it up. So speaking of world bosses, I was able to solo every one of them except for one, mainly because I only gave up after one shot, but I will say that a few of the world bosses are memorable and interesting as well as fun to engage with, but I wouldn't say they stand out like the ones from the previous expansion, but they aren't bad either. It's just that the way the map is designed in this expansion makes doing boss runs a little more annoying, because Red Mountain is in the way, and the bosses are spread out on all sides of the volcano. You'll find yourself running to the nearest shrine, constantly teleporting between the bosses to attempt runs on them, and it's a time-consuming effort if you are forced to do it for grinding out gear or whatnot. While we're on the subject, how is the gear farming? Well, it's not great. I remember War Maiden being used for mag blades at some point, but there are far better sets out there for that setup. It's not good for mage setups that use elemental damage because it doesn't increase that damage type, so it's something to think about. And Shackle Breaker looks like it could be useful to some people, but it's a 5-piece set effect that is boring. Could be useful for builds that require both resources, but I don't know. Nothing to drop panties for. Master Architect and War Machine might be cool for trials, arenas, and dungeons. I've seen a few builds around that use it, and some people have said it's a powerful set when Morrowind came out. Not sure if it still holds up today, however. Warrior Poet's armor set is interesting in that it's not as good as any other tanking set out there, but can be useful for random dungeon groups to fill in gaps where a warden would be. So other than that, it's kind of trash tier. Coward's gear, on the other hand, might actually be useful and find some purchase with solo builds. Don't quote me on that, however, because I'm still very early in the stages of theory crafting that kind of setup, and there's probably a better set out there. Overall, these sets can be useful for specific builds, especially the Coward set for certain PvP modes like Capture to Relic. Beyond that, there's probably better sets out there if you're buying this just for the item sets, especially if you're a stamina build. Other expansions will have you covered better than this one. The trial, well, I wasn't able to do the trial. I tried, I posted to Twitter, I shouted in chat, I searched for guilds. I wasn't able to get into a group doing the trial, which is a shame. I have a few applications into guilds, and if any of them get back to me before I record and finalize the video, I will add some details about the trials to the end of this video and critique them individually there. And just like the Orsinium expansion, Morrowind does not have a dungeon or anchors, so the only meaningful group content you get is a trial. Again, pretty disappointing. So in closing out the Morrowind portion of the video, I would say that I recommend the expansion with all the asterisks above. Don't expect anything that can compete with ES3 narratively, but you can expect a fun addition to ESO with surprisingly good side quests. And it's funny that I didn't mention those, but yeah, there's some of the better content in the game. So really, buy this expansion for the side quests and parts of the main story and setting. Other than that, Orsinium is still better. Clockwork City. Alright, let's get started with this one. Before I get started with this shit, however, we gotta talk about something. ESO has some of the worst quality of life in regards to how the story is presented from DLC to DLC. See, each major chapter that gets released is now released alongside a smaller, less significant content pack that acts as a prequel to the chapter they're going to release later, like an appetizer pre-meal. I did not know this, and I ended up skipping to Clockwork City before playing Summerset, only to find out later that Clockwork City is a direct sequel to the story from Morrowind, and to totally understand what was happening in Summerset, I needed to play this DLC first. I didn't know that, so I didn't play it. I skipped it. And that's because this game does nothing to guide you. The number one thing that this game is missing is a contiguous storyline that goes chronologically from beginning to end, guiding you from each storyline in order of beginning to end. The reason, I reckon, why it's missing is because unless you own every DLC or sub to ESO Plus, you'll be chugging along the storyline only to run into a paywall and be unable to continue. So I guess instead of doing something like that anyway and relegating it to only members of ESO Plus, they just didn't bother, and I hate it. I really wish there was some kind of way to just play the game and chronological order reliably without having to go online and do a bunch of research to figure out what comes next. This is the problem with cutting up all your content into chunks like this. Like, to me, you don't sell Morrowind without the dungeon and the Clockwork City DLC. I mean, that's a complete package. You know what I'm saying? Especially at the price that they charge for these things. Instead, ZeniMax seems content with having a much worse player experience if it means that they can cut up their content into little pieces and nickel and dime their audience every chance they get. So I skipped Clockwork City at first. I figured I would go back and check it out since I had already seen how the story concluded. And because I had already seen how the story concluded, I can tell you that I wasn't really looking forward to playing it. And as far as I'm concerned, that is 100% the fault of the game for presenting these prequels as the lesser content packs that they arguably are. They are shorter than the main chapters, they have 1/3 of the amount of delves as the regular chapters, no public dungeons, 1/3 the amount of world bosses, and at times a much shorter story on top of having a much smaller zone to explore. Is it any wonder why I just skipped this DLC initially? The world bosses in this DLC are okay, not great. They are difficult, however, at least for me at the time, and I was only able to beat one of them solo and came close to soloing the second, but kept losing my ass to him. All in all, challenging enough to shout for help in zone chat, which is great. Actual meaningful group content. The delves, on the other hand, are fairly okay. The one that takes place in the Clockwork Ruins was pretty cool because the design of those places is kind of fantastic, and I enjoyed the look and design of the place as it felt like I was actually trying to navigate a maze-like structure, and for a moment, I sort of just forgot about my criticisms of other delves where they're just like rooms connected by hallways, because essentially these delves are the same, but because they're so alien and industrial looking, their purpose could have been anything. So that part of my brain just sort of shut off and I was able to enjoy them for what they were. Now we got to talk about the main story, and oh boy, does this story start off with a bang. You get a message saying that a guy you've probably heard before, Fear, is looking for you in a tribunal temple in Dragonhold. And man, did the memories come flooding back. See, in ES3, Deveith had a personality, which was odd for characters in Morrowind, because for the most part, characters didn't really have character traits, because their dialogue was usually like wiki entries more than dialogue. Every now and then, however, you'd find a character with some personality, and those characters stood out the most. Deveith is one of them, because of the lore surrounding him and his little proclivities. First off, I have to say, his voice kind of shocked me. He has this calm but authoritative voice, and it more than fits him, while at the same time kind of feeling unexpected.
I do. The Tribunes are not so clever that they could hide such a place from me for long. The city is quite close, and also very far away. Just the first of Sotha Seal's many paradoxes. If you choose to join me, be prepared for many more.
But I can honestly say that instead of assassinating his character like they did Barbas in Morrowind, he actually managed to not only give this guy character traits and a personality, they also made him likable. Right off the bat, he starts talking about how resistant he is to authority, and for a man as powerful as he's supposed to be, that totally makes sense that he wouldn't want anyone trying to hold him back.
The Father of Mysteries, the Clockwork God, the Tinkerer, and other such banal titles. The Sotha Seal, or Set, is a member of the Dark Elf Tribunal. He reigns over Morrowind as the god of craft and sorcery.
Then he starts talking about my boy, your boy, everyone's boy, the Nerevar, and he gives quite a lot of backstory on this topic as extra optional dialogue, and this DLC does this a lot.
I studied with him before his ascent, and even then he defied comprehension. His only true peer was Indoril Nerevar. Such a shame what happened to him. Indeed, Saint Nerevar the Captain, our king and greatest champion for a time. He died, tragically, during a journey to the heart of Red Mountain. It was all very sudden. Some believe his retainer, Dagoth struck the mortal blow. Others... Some believe that Sotha Seal, Vivek, and Almalexia murdered Nerevar so they could take divine power for themselves.
You might have noticed something that's here that was not here in Morrowind, and that is a backstory and much needed context as to the events that are happening in the world. It's awesome. There's all kinds of extra dialogue that helps flesh out what's happening in the world, especially Devea's dialogue, which is some of the best in the entire game. And when he talks about Nerevar, he does so with reverence befitting a man who proclaims to not respect belief or tradition as much as he respects power. He recognized Nerevar for what he was, a very powerful Mur. The dialogue is the highlight of the DLC, I assure you. Then you must navigate what seems like a Dwemer mine, and the scope of this place is impressive and very cool looking. There's a lot of creativity that went into this DLC, and you can absolutely tell the devs were inspired by the subject matter and the lore behind it, because they absolutely nailed the look of some of these places, especially in the main story. And there's something that ESO does better than just about any Elder Scrolls game, and that's communicating the sheer scope and size of some of these delves and dungeons. I mean, when you go into a cave in like vanilla Skyrim or Morrowind or something like that, you're kind of confined to these tunnels, these small tunnels, and small little areas that are all connected by Lego bricks, because that's how they create their caves. But if you look at these things are cavernous. They're huge, deep, like empty looking caves with all of this intricate architecture built around it. It's fantastic. Like, the way some of these delves and dungeons look, especially in these DLCs, is phenomenal. A big step up from the vanilla game. This place is quite large, and it takes a decent amount of time to fully explore it, and eventually I arrive at the Clockwork City, an actual city inside what amounts to a snow globe. We're shrunk down and sucked into another pocket dimension, but not the one we're looking for, and upon getting there, Devea's shadow pops out of him and comes alive. And we must traverse the trap-laden ruins to eventually fight the shadow so Devea can reclaim his power, and at the end he shows just how powerful he is by swatting an impressive amount of mechanical people away like gnats. Eventually we arrive in the Clockwork City, and the map is quite impressive looking, lots of interesting architecture with a lake of oil surrounding everything. We arrive at the gates and meet an important official in the Brass City, and we're told that we need to find a sponsor in the form of a citizen to vouch for us to become a citizen. If we don't become a citizen, I have no idea what will happen, because there doesn't seem to be any consequences. I guess people will just be annoyed by you. This starts up a quest to investigate the disappearance of some people in the city, and this quest is quite cool. It leverages some mechanics we haven't seen before, has you partaking in some espionage, and in general is a pretty inventive way to use already existing mechanics to break up the monotony in gameplay a bit. Then we meet up with Devea Fear again, and he drops a bombshell on us. He's met with Sotha Sil, and not only does he not seem like himself, but Devea is convinced that he is not Sotha Sil, and he confirms his suspicions with an observation. Sotha Sil never second guesses himself, and in fact is a creature of clockwork habits. And just today, he's changed his patrol routes 3 times and changed some edicts around. There's no way this is Sotha Sil, and this is where the DLC had its hooks in me. I needed to see this storyline all the way through, and it's the first time, honestly, the story in ESO had me hooked. Then there's all the extra dialogue that happens outside the story but is tangentially related to it, from ambient dialogue that informs the player about events that are a consequence of their actions, to completely missable and optional dialogue that you must engage the characters even though they don't have a quest marker. There's so much optional dialogue, and it's rather jarring given the criticisms I had about the Morrowind DLC's obvious lack in that department. It's a nice change of pace, and it helps to spice up the world. Not to mention, every extra piece of dialogue you have with Devea is friggin' hilarious. Like when he comments on one of the religious zealots saying, "I rather quite liked her until she opened her mouth." Classic. Never change, Mr. Fear. Then there's a part near the middle of the story where you interact with some animals. I won't spoil it, and it's a genuinely funny experience with a great premise, and it was super fun, and I sincerely could have spent so much more time with those characters. And the endings. The friggin' ending. Like, with a caveat, the final fight is a joke, which at this point, I can't say that I'm surprised, but the conversations you have with all the characters that you've been working with this entire time, it's all great stuff and puts a satisfying little bow on their stories. And the choice you get to make at the end is actually pretty impactful from a personal standpoint. And best of all, you get a final conversation with Sotha Sil at the end, which is, quite honestly, probably the best piece of dialogue that has ever come from a piece of Elder Scrolls media. I mean that. This DLC is now one of my favorite storylines in Elder Scrolls. It's so good that I wish it was longer. If you're like me and you love the lore of Morrowind and ES3, then this is a must-have DLC, which is perplexing to be honest, because had I experienced this DLC before the Summerset story, I have a feeling my whole experience would have been so much more different. So I need to tell you this now, intrepid viewer, whatever you do, experience these DLCs in chronological order. Don't do what I did, as it will tarnish what could otherwise be a great experience. Now that reminds me, the art in this DLC is cohesive and adheres to the world perfectly, and that's great. Even the monsters and wildlife adhere slavishly to the premise of an entirely Clockwork city. It's cartoony at times, but I love that they were brave enough to stick with the premise. There's a story that someone tells you about mechanical rats that overran the city, and they had to create mechanical cats to hunt them, and then they needed dogs until the city was overrun with mechanical bears. It's shit like that that makes the world a believable space, even in this case where the world is unbelievable, so when unbelievable things happen, we just accept it. That style carries over to everything. The books are made of metal tablets which revolve on a conveyor belt in what acts as this DLC's version of bookshelves. The crafting benches are changed to fit the theme as well. What's even more impressive is that there's a whole lexicon of slang that was invented just for this DLC that completely fits in with the theme of the city, like calling imperfect people tarnished and people that they don't like slag, stuff like that. It's little touches like this that really serve to bring this DLC to life. I love this DLC. Then there's the item sets, and there's a bunch of 2-weapon item sets that do some interesting things when you use specific skills or based on things like your total bonus movement speed. They are interesting and might even be staples in certain PvP builds, but I can't be sure. There's not a whole lot of info about them being used in forums. Concentrated Force, for instance, used to be used in certain Dragon Knight builds, but they fixed an issue with that item that made it fall out of favor. But I'm gonna be honest, I like the idea of these weapon sets, and I wish they caught on because they sort of adhere to the idea of Diablo 3 loot, which focused in item set's power around the use of a main skill and enhanced the power of that main skill by adding abilities to it. There's Fortified Brass and Innate Axiom, which are decent leveling sets. Then there's sets like Livewire and Mad Tinkerer, which the former is great for trash mobs and trials, and the latter is good for trash mobs and dungeons. And they both have interesting procs, and that Livewire just looks cool as shit, while the Mad Tinkerer has a great effect that spawns a Fabricant that deals damage to everything in a line. But its downside is that it can only happen once every 8 seconds, which means it has a lot of downtime. Then there's Unfathomable Darkness, which is a set that I started collecting because I love that it has a different spread of different damaging abilities, and the proc calls in a murder of crows to peck the enemies around you. And this ability only has 3 seconds of downtime, which means it could theoretically proc often. I love the theme of this set, and I'm considering making a Nightblade around this theme just to see what I can do with it, but it's not a meta set. It's like just shy of being a meta set for PvP, but alas, it's not best in slot, but it is easier to obtain and cheaper than the meta and almost as good, so I really like it. All in all, it's pretty good sets. There's little things that this DLC comes with, like the transmutation table, which is an incredibly helpful tool that helps to save you a ton of grinding, and it's clear that around this time the dev team over at ESO were actually listening to their player base, because you could see the efforts they took to provide much needed and much asked for quality of life to the game. Overall, I'd say that this DLC is worth the price, if not just for the story alone, but for everything it brings with it. Summerset continues the trends set up in previous DLCs. It's got 6 world bosses, 6 delves, 2 public dungeons, a trial, and a dungeon that you don't get to play unless you bought the other DLCs. If there are any hardcore players in the audience, how do you feel about the DLCs being chopped up like this? Like with Elseweyr, which we'll get to, being chopped up into Elseweyr chapters with separate DLC for dungeons and separate DLC for Southern Elseweyr. Like, do you like this practice? And if not, why not? I'm interested in hearing about it because I freaking hate this practice. It feels greedy while at the same time being able to be justified by saying, if you want this, then what's the point of buying all this other stuff to get it? So yeah, I see. There's an argument both ways. Where do you stand on it? Now, as far as world bosses, I have to say there's actually quite a lot of improvement here. Unlike the previous 2 expansions, this one has much more difficult world bosses with mechanics that require more than one person to take them down. Now, to be clear, I was able to solo all the world bosses in Hrothgar except for one, and the same for Morrowind. But in this expansion, 2 of them just seemed straight up impossible. And one of them was a pain in the ass to kill because of lag and getting one shot because of rubber banding. It got so bad that I just straight up gave up trying to kill that boss. I'm sure the 2 I failed to kill aren't impossible, but even adding just one other player with a companion made bosses that I thought were impossible a cakewalk. I like this. It's meaningful group content. It's content that requires a group for most players, and that's what all these expansions had been missing. It's like the devs at ZeniMax were learning as they went, and this is when they finally got it together. There is one world boss, however, that I absolutely hated, and it's not because he was hard, because he was the easiest world boss in the expansion. No, I hated him because of one of his mechanics. See, this crab is an asshole. He spits other crabs at you and does a little slam attack, but the annoying part of him is the fact that after a few seconds, he will burrow underground and become impervious to attacks. It takes forever to kill him because of how often and quickly he will do this maneuver. Now, you would think for a damage over time heavy build like mine that this would be great for me, because all I have to do is drop some dots on him before he burrows underground, and while I'm dodging his attacks and killing his adds, he's taking several ticks of damage. That sounds perfect, and that would be great if not for the fact that when he burrows underground, all your status effects fall off of him and he takes no damage. Coupled with the fact that he goes underground after only a few attacks, and you have eliminated the most useful of one of my primary tactics for my build for seemingly arbitrary reasons. Because by the time the dots actually start ticking, which is 2 seconds by the way, the damn crab is getting ready to go underground. I mean, I can't see a logical reason why this happened. In fact, it seems like the enemy actually despawns from the level while they're underground, so it seems like the reason those dots fall off is not some logical reason, but instead because of the faulty way in which this encounter was designed. It happens because of what could be considered maybe a bug. It sucks, and I'm surprised no one has complained sufficiently enough to force them to change that mechanic, because there's no good reason I could think of for why it's still there. And other fights contradict this mechanic as well. The fight with the deer thingy, it has it phasing in and out of reality and teleporting to the other side of the map. Yet in this fight, the dots stay up on the creature instead of falling off when it disappears. It's odd. Because of these 2 fights, this one makes the most logical sense to have the dots fall off on, if any, and they don't. It's weird. But in general, I feel like this expansion is an improvement from the previous expansions in that there is much more to do with groups in this one by virtue of having actual difficult world bosses, and the world bosses especially provide a good enough challenge to push people to group together to take them down. And on top of that, this expansion has not only a trial, but also a dungeon. At least that's what I thought. See, in order to do this video, I purchased a couple of months of ESO Plus so that I could have access to all the DLCs and all the content up to now, except for the newest DLC, of course. So I thought that the dungeon that appears on the map was included with the Summerset Isle, and I thought, wow, you know, they really did learn a lesson. But no, they sold that dungeon as DLC. In fact, I'm starting to think that dungeons are always carved out of the DLC experience and sold separately, which I don't even know what to think about this, really. I mean, on one hand, if you're the type of player that doesn't play the DLC PvE content and prefer the dungeon experience over anything else, well, this is a boon to you. You get your favorite content and you get it for way cheaper than if you were to buy the expansions. But if you enjoy both, well, this sucks because something that should come with a dungeon doesn't come with a dungeon, and it's not like these expansions are cheap. I mean, Necrom costs $50. Of course, if you buy that from the Steam page, you supposedly get access to a bunch of expansions, with some notable exceptions, the dungeons. If you want them, you gotta pay an extra $20 for the 1,500 crowns to purchase them separately, or pay the monthly fee. And oddly enough, because I paid the monthly fee and got the crafting bag, I realized something else. See, I was thinking about the obvious blind spot that I had in the last video that a couple of commenters pointed out. They said that if I was looking in crates, barrels, vases, and urns, I would find a lot more motifs for crafting. And to my surprise, they were 100% correct. I found, just in the time it has taken me to make this video, 8 crafting motifs for the base racial styles, but only 1 page for the unique motifs. It was much more difficult to find a unique motifs than it is to find the racial ones because, for one, the racial styles come bundled into one item. Very convenient. The unique styles, on the other hand, come with a page per armor piece, which makes it hard to find all the pieces of one style, especially considering the fact that you can get multiple copies of the same page. So this system of super rare RNG drops, coupled with the fact that you can find duplicates and the style pages are far too expensive for most players to buy from shops, this is essentially by design to force players to use real money on the stores. But even if you don't agree with that, I'm willing to concede that point. What was shocking to me was why I wasn't looking inside the barrels and boxes in the first place. That is 100% the fault of the inventory system. Without a crafting bag, your inventory fills up really fast. And I realized very early on that taking the food and alchemy ingredients from all those different containers wasn't useful in any way because I needed that space in my inventory for weapons and armor to break down for experience points. And the most important factor to that was the fact that there are a million different food items in these containers and each new ingredient takes up 1 slot. All of this so I can carry around a food item that sells for 1 gold piece to use in a food recipe I don't have, nor intend to spend points making. So I just, stopped looking in those containers because I didn't realize it's how motifs drop, and there was nothing else in those containers that I actually needed. Do you see how the greed gets in the way of teaching the players valuable information? It's a real problem in this game. Anyway, delves. Just like before, there are 6 delves. But unlike before, most of these delves are wide open spaces, interestingly designed and fun to explore with multiple bosses at times, which gives more reasons to grind them out. The 2 public dungeons are good, however, I kind of forgot all about them the moment I finished them, whereas the Orsinium dungeons, they're still burned into my memory. Then there's the map design, and I want to talk about this at length because I think it's interesting, but in order to make my point, I have to talk about the previous 2 world maps. Orsinium has the best map out of all the DLCs so far. It's wide, it's open, and the only time it has obstructions blocking your way is to funnel you into a small area to break up the design of the map. It has multiple biomes, each with its own personality. It's a great example of a Bethesda-style map, and ZeniMax did an excellent job with it. Morrowind, well, Morrowind's Morrowind. It has a big friggin' volcano in the middle of it. It makes it pretty hard to traverse because of it. And this isn't necessarily the fault of the DLC. The flow of the map was established in the previous games, and they inherited that design. Where the map does fail is in how much smaller it feels and how cramped all the detail they crammed in feels. It frankly feels a little claustrophobic. And there's a lot of stuff that's missing from the OG game that I wish they would have made an effort to include. But I want to concentrate on the flow for a minute. Coming off the back of Orsinium, where it was actually fun to traverse the map, and I frankly didn't do a whole lot of teleporting around, and instead chose to explore a lot more, and therefore took in a lot more of the details, Morrowind feels like you can't reasonably traverse the island because there's a really big friggin' obstacle taking up most of the explorable space. So while Orsinium had a map where most of the land is explorable, Morrowind had a map where it felt like most of it was unexplorable, or you had no reason to explore it. Because if you look at it, there's nothing in the Red Mountain region to see. So why would you even go there? It's a big missed opportunity in my opinion. Then we come to Summerset, and this is where I think the maps start to get a little tiresome in their design. See all these highlighted areas? These are places you cannot traverse in the overland map. And if you zoom out and look at them all together, you'll start to realize that nearly half of this map isn't even explorable. So you think you're getting a map this size, but you're really getting a map this size. And the other map suffers the same fate. Half of this map is unexplorable and has nothing to see. So you might be looking at the maps like, wow, that's a lot of space to explore, only to find out that half of it is unreachable, so you're getting half the map you think you're getting. But not only that, to go from here to here, because of all the obstacles in your way, you need to go all the way up, over, down, and over again, just to traverse this tiny little space. This causes a player to no longer explore the map once all the way shrines have been unlocked, which means the players will just be teleporting all over the place. But it also discourages exploration, which means that players who are looking for people to help with world bosses are less likely to run into other players by accident or organically, because no one is walking from this space to this space, and is instead teleporting and only walking from the way shrine to the mission. I didn't run across too many other players when doing POIs on the map, and whenever I did a world boss, I had to shout for more help often than in any other map that I've played so far, which is why I haven't completed as many world bosses as I did on previous maps. I don't like the way that this map is designed layout wise, but I do like the way it looks. It is a very unique space to explore. The coral spaces, the architecture of the high elves, and the forests and pirate themes all go together very nicely, and as far as being a unique space, it rivals Morrowind at times in looking alien yet like a feasible part of the world. Then we come to the main story. This is an odd one because it's definitely the most memorable, exciting, and interesting plot with a great cast of characters, but it's also slow and long. The length isn't necessarily a bad thing, but being slow is. It's slow because it takes this story a really long time to get going. Each mission takes a while to finish. I'd say it takes about 9 to 10 hours to complete the story if you're rushing through it, and that feels like it's longer than Orsinium, but it's not, according to player polls, which is surprising, as Orsinium didn't feel that long, but I think that's a testament to how good that DLC is, that you can spend that much time in the map and not get tired of it as quickly as I tired of Summerset. Part of that is the map layout, but part of that is how slow the story takes to get going. Once the story does get going, however, it gets really good. There's a cast of characters, and I'll take the risk of spoiling something here. Clavicus Vile makes a return here, along with some other princes I won't talk about, and they improve the character of Barbas a little bit, but still not to the point where I would say they've repaired the damage they did to him in Morrowind. But you can tell there was an attempt made, likely because nerds like me threw a friggin' fit when they saw Barbas at the end of that DLC. Other than that, I would say this DLC has some of the best characters in the DLCs I've played thus far. Except for maybe Clockwork City. See, the problem I've always had with Beth and ESO characters is that they're too static. You know, they have nothing going on outside of their function to you as a quest giver. But in Summerset, these characters have their own lives going on, family ties, difficulties, traumas, and it's all dealt with subtly without having to hammer the player with exposition. There's attempts at characterization here with a certain Golden Knight, and I have to say, it felt really flat. Like whenever he'd say something that's supposed to be funny or supposed to show his character, it always felt super out of place. Like you never set up this relationship between these two people or this joke, and it comes out of nowhere in the middle of a serious moment. It feels like ZeniMax was trying to quip like a Marvel movie, but I digress. Overall, It's a great story with decent characters in a world that feels more alive than most of the previous DLCs, and I think it's a vast improvement over previous stories, save for maybe Orsinium and Clockwork City, which I can't stop talking about apparently. Then there's the item sets, the real reason anyone plays these DLCs. Summerset items are actually pretty good. There are sets like Arms of Relican, which is a great set for single target DPS and not so great on multiple targets. But if you are weaving in your light attacks every time you use a skill, this set will apply stacks of dots that increase in power, and it's great for burning down bosses. I've heard, but cannot confirm, that this is one of the best single target DPS sets in the game, at least at the time of this DLC releasing. Adept Rider is an interesting set. It's mainly a tank set, but the 5-piece gives you a major gallop and expedition at all times, which I can see a lot of uses for, especially when doing non-combat related activities like thieving, where combining this set with other speed sets can get you to the movement speed cap. And when you're breaking and entering, speed is pretty important. And you can use this set and Chaotic Whirlwind, for example, in order to get a maximum bonus of 450 spell damage and weapon damage and get to the movement speed cap, or you could use Coward's Gear as well. It's a synergy, I just don't know if it's worth the trade-off, to be honest with you. Like, as much as I would like this synergy to work out, I'm not sure if 450 weapon damage is worth giving up something else if you're a DPS. Maybe a tank could benefit from this, but I bet there's probably better gear out there. Farming materials can benefit from this set as well for obvious reasons, and I can see an argument for this set being used in PvP as well. Grace of Gloom seems like a good set, but the opinion from the community is pretty mixed. It looks like to me that this set could be very good when combined with other tanking sets, since Major Evasion can go really good with other forms of defensive buffs, and the passive heal is pretty good, but it's a half up, half down type of buff, which means that it'll be useful 50% of the time you use it and shit the rest of the time. Overall, there's a lot to like with these sets, and it has enough diversity to cover just about every class and role, and there are surprisingly strong sets too, so if you're only going to buy one DLC to use for grinding out gear, this or Orsinium might be the one you want. This DLC, Murkmire, like Clockwork City, is 1/3 the size of a normal DLC, but unlike the Clockwork City DLC, it doesn't have the artistic cohesion or the narrative charm or even great dialogue like its predecessor did, and it's the start of what feels like a slide into mediocrity. This, like the Clockwork DLC, was played after I played the Elseweyr DLC because I didn't think it was worth looking at, and unfortunately, unlike with Clockwork City, I was right. Let's look at this from the top down, starting with the activities. There's not many of them. You got 2 delves, and each of them are frankly pretty underwhelming. The world bosses are pushovers, and you can easily solo them with decent gear. Then instead of a trial, we get another arena. I liked the Maelstrom arena. It was a fun distraction that had nice encounter design, but we need to talk about something else. The art direction. Coming off of Morrowind and Clockwork City, we've been a little spoiled because those expansions had things that old players like myself really dig, like Dwemer stuff, volcanoes, the entirety of Clockwork City. In those DLCs, there was a lot of original looking stuff. Something I didn't touch on in the previous review of Morrowind is just how that place looked. It looked like Morrowind, but expanded on a little. You know, the Telvanni areas had these weird pustule fungus things growing on the tree roots. The flora had a Lovecraft theme going on with tentacles and stuff. It was like what I've seen before, but expanded on. I liked it. Clockwork City was just awesome from the ground up. I mean, I loved it. It chose a theme, and it stuck with that theme, even when it was ridiculous, and it really leaned into those parts, which I appreciate. Then we come to what should be the chance to expand on the lore of the Argonians in interesting ways, since this is one of the areas a mainline Elder Scrolls title has yet to really focus on. I think we all expected a swamp, right? I mean, it makes sense, since this is what the pre-established lore as far as I know is said, but I wasn't expecting them to go with exactly what I expected. I mean, what's the first thing you think of when you think Argonian homeland? Here's what I expected. I expected a jungle or a swamp, either one, Mayan architecture, and for the Argonians to be like a stand-in for Native Americans. I fucking called this shit without even having seen the DLC. I mean, I called it completely. This DLC had no surprises for me. I mean, I shit you not. I teleported into this area, had a look around, and said out loud, well shit, this is boring. Like, not even joking. Like, I looked at the architecture, the huts suspended on bamboo that could not possibly hold up the house, the rope bridges, the Mayan temples, and I just sighed. I knew I was in for something truly special in just how unspecial it truly was. Now, let's take a look at the kind of flora they have in this place. Weird, hostile plants. That's cool. Very fitting. Not much to say about it. Creeping vines all over the place. Check. Roger that. Gotcha. Then we come to fauna. And my dudes and dudettes in Christ, did they ever phone it in here? This DLC actually has a lot of original enemy types that you haven't seen up to now. The problem is that all of the later DLCs start reusing all of the creatures from this DLC in order to fill out their anemic rosters of new enemy types. Like, would you believe me if I told you that the further on we get into these DLCs, the more lazy they seem to get? And even then, the biggest, most original addition to the enemy roster is, drumroll please, a green slime and a turtle. Overall, pretty underwhelming stuff when you think about the environment you're in. I mean, it's a jungle, guys. I mean, have you ever seen some of the stuff in a jungle? Just the invertebrates alone are friggin' nuts. How about this terrifying bitch? How about this cute little bugger? How about this cute little guy, but bigger and more intimidating? Or how about a giant version of this gross thing? You had a chance, my dogs, to do anything, to draw on what is a crazy environment of insane wonders, and you chose to go with alligators, lizards, and swamp thing. I mean, look at this dude. This dude has an actual dick for a nose. You could have had a dick-nosed monkey in your game, and you blew it! I guess I don't mind the Mayan influence, even if it was a bit predictable. They lean into it, and that's great. I just don't think anything presented here is all that compelling, because nothing special is ever done with it. Let's talk about the story, because it's relevant. The story starts in the main town when you run into this plain-looking Karen who wants to do an expedition into the jungle to find some ancient artifacts. And there was an opportunity here that was never really seized on, and that's the Indiana Jones angle. You got everything else. You got a jungle, ruins with dart traps, ancient artifacts with ambiguous mystical powers, primitive tribes of people who believe in superstition, and all of that potential is wasted because the dungeon design in the main story is as flat as you can imagine. It starts out with just plain old dungeons with traps here and there, and the occasional, albeit decent puzzle. But there's only one puzzle. The traps aren't all that challenging to traverse, and there's none of the grandiosity of the death traps in the Indiana Jonesing genre. You know, no huge boulders hurtling towards you down a ramp, no closing walls of spikes, nothing you'd expect, and instead, you do get a room filling up with gas, which has no consequences if you die in it because you're supposed to. Didn't like it, would not bang, would not invite to my house for my mom's spaghetti. So anyway, lady invites you to help her get artifacts, and you find out that there's another faction out there trying to get artifacts before you, and they are obviously the bad guys. And you meet a cast of characters, some with the absolutely flattest voice acting I have ever heard, with the flattest characters and development that by the end of the DLC, when you have to decide who dies, I just picked one at random. The beginning of the story is slow as hell, but halfway through it picks up a little and it gets kind of interesting, and they play around with souls and memories in a cool way, and there's some attempts at cool plot points that never really reach their full potential. because they aren't expanded on, because the story is over in 4 or 5 hours. It is probably the shortest story of all the DLCs. Then, near the end of the story, there's a totally predictable betrayal that was foreshadowed in a very unsubtle way that undermines the surprise you might have had, and because you barely spend any time with these people, and because the story is so short, none of these characters have time to grow on you, so when they die or betray you, you don't feel anything about it, and it just falls so flat. Maybe this is burnout speaking, but I honestly felt no reason to play this DLC, and was going to recommend you skip this one. But then I had a thought. This shit has an arena. So I went into guild chat to see if anyone was running an arena. Crickets. I petitioned in Discord. Again, silence. I left that guild, joined another guild, tried again. Do I smell through the friggin' internet or something? Why does no one want to play with me? I'm beginning to feel like the kid who gets picked last for dodgeball. Then I tried zone chat, and again, no dice. So I said, you know what? I'm a guy with a solo build, so why don't I try to solo it? Here's how that went.
Not good.
So while I wish I could give you my opinion of the arena in Murkmire, I can't really give you anything firsthand because I couldn't, for the life of me, get into a group to do it. My friends that do play ESO still don't have the Murkmire DLC, so that's out the window. So yeah, I tried and I failed, sorry. Then we gotta talk about the item sets. There's 2 item sets that were pretty cool in the Elseweyr expansion. I like them because they do unique things to single abilities, and I really like it when an item does more than increase stats, and in some way, even a small way, changes how a skill is used, or better yet, what a skill does. Like Perfected Radial Uppercut, which deals 45% of its total damage to all enemies near your target and turns a powerful single target ability into a limited AoE. Or Perfected Wild Impulse, which gives you a small boost to your damage in the form of different elements. I like these sets, and wish they did even more unique things to skills in the vein of the Diablo 3 sets. Then there's Bright Throat's Boast, which is a pretty cool set. If you have a drink buff active, it gives you an extra 2000 magicka and 133 magicka recovery. This seems like a good set for people who can't afford the best in slot gear, and I've heard things about pairing this gear with Witchmother's Potent Brew. Deadwater's Guile, last I heard, was an absolutely disgusting set for solo content because of the ultimate regen and for trash pools and group content, but they changed the mechanic at some point where instead of when an enemy dies, you get 15 ultimate, it's whenever you get the killing blow, which is less good in groups. This set is super situational. Then there's Might of the Lost Legion, which is, it's impressive if you like dog shit sets. This set has one problem to me, and that's the fact that it spreads out the stat gain over all 3 resources. I actually think that if you were to make this set a stamina crit set with the same 5 set bonus, and you paired it with Sunderflame and made the heavy attack bonus of Sunderflame scale with the Empower bonus, this could be a really good set. If not just a cool theme set for fire DKs, I don't know. I like the idea of it, just poor execution. Then there's Naga Shaman. The buffs have a 100% uptime, and you gain them on damage shield, so you could take cleave on a Dragon Knight and have a pretty nice buff to your heals for, well, forever. I'm willing to bet this set shines in PvP. Overall, a pretty decent lineup. Now on to Elseweyr. Elseweyr is actually the first DLC I ever bought aside from Morrowind because I got into this game pretty late in its life cycle. I remember at the time the game had a completely different opening tutorial from what it has now. You were placed into a monastery that was under attack by dragons, and this sets you up with the background of this chapter. Big cat box that's under attack by dragons. Cool. I played through the tutorial, then one main story mission, and then I dropped it and never played it again. I don't know why I lost interest in it. I don't know what turned me off. All I know is that I started a new character, barely played it, promptly put it down, and quit playing ESO for about a year. Now, I want to qualify this by saying that I don't think it was this DLC that stopped me from playing. I just think that I was already done playing the game by the time it came out. Now, I gotta say that this is the DLC that I probably liked the least of all the DLCs that I played, and I don't know if it's because of burnout. I don't think it is, because I played Elseweyr before I played Clockwork City, and I went on to say the Clockwork City was one of the best DLCs I ever played. So I don't think I could chalk it up to that. I think it just was really boring in a lot of ways, and most of it was the story, which is perplexing because I hear from a lot of people that Elseweyr is their favorite DLC. Now, just like all the other DLCs that have come before this, there are the same amount of delves, world bosses, and so on. But what this DLC lacks that the other DLCs did not is there is a distinct lack of way shrines for fast travel, and this is probably one of the most complicated open world maps in any of the DLCs that I've played, and it definitely could have used a couple more to provide some form of convenience because the map design is sort of all over the place as far as having paths up and down to various elevations on the map. And it sometimes suffers from the trope of having to walk 100 feet in order to progress 10 feet. Where the map design is improved from Summerset is that there is much less wasted space here. There's very little in the way of mountains carving off half the map and keeping you from exploring, but this map does lean on the same bullshit that Summerset did, with there only being narrow pathways from one place to the next. There's a main loop around the map on the outer rim and a bunch of little branching paths leading to various activities, and that's fun to explore the first time, but it's not all that fun a second and third time. And just like the previous DLC, you'll probably lean on the fast travel system to get around, which can be problematic because there's not a whole lot of way shrines around to facilitate that kind of style of play. It's less annoying here to get from one side of the map to the other, however, because they smartly put a bunch of paths cutting through the mountainous regions, heading from the northern path to the southern path, which eliminates a lot of running around in circles that you do in other similarly designed fake open worlds. Now, I want to point out that I don't necessarily hate this type of open world design. I think it works in a game like Elden Ring, where there are paths to follow to get from point A to point B, but once you get to point B, it's usually a big, vast open space, and even when the spaces aren't all that open, they're still rather large, while ESO has spaces like that here and there, but by comparison, it still feels smaller. Like Elden Ring's areas are also visually distinct, and to this day, I can recreate the entire Elden Ring map in my memory along with points of interest. In Elseweyr, everything is sort of the same shade of brown. All the areas sort of blend into one another, and you end up relying heavily on the map for navigation, whereas I prefer a more free-form type of exploration that uses landmarks for navigation. It's not bad, I just don't prefer it. Then we come to the 6 delves in the game, and I gotta say, and they're pretty damn underwhelming. I don't remember anything about these places other than the tile set that was used to design them. They definitely don't stand out like some of the delves from Summerset, and their layouts felt pretty standard, whereas some of the delves in Summerset had an impressive scale and scope to them that made them immediately stand out in my mind, and therefore became a more memorable part of that experience. I actually went back through my footage to look at the delves, and the thing that stood out the most to me is how familiar they felt. And that's when I realized that I had seen this type of dungeon before. Corridors? Check. Corridors connecting big, empty, purposeless rooms? Check. Squares connecting hallways and loops? Check. These delves are just larger versions of the vanilla ESO delves. Quite a step down in my opinion. Like, it's odd. I don't think I would be picking out all these details in other delves from other DLCs because, for the most part, those areas told a story with their levels. It's something that Bethesda is known for, while ZeniMax is known for lawsuits. The problem I have with these areas is that each of these rooms that we explore don't seem to serve a purpose that we can discern just by looking at them. Look at this room and tell me what purpose it serves. How about the one connected to it? How about the one connected to that one? What is the purpose of these rooms? Why are they connected like this? And why would anyone design a place like this? Why would anyone try to design a functioning building like this? None of these questions are answered because these delves are not designed to be real places, but instead to be an activity that the players will spend X amount of time on exploring and then move on. Flat and uninspiring, just a series of interconnected rooms that loop in on themselves, dotted with enemies that are just waiting around for someone to stumble onto them and hit them with the stat stick. But again, this criticism kind of hinges depends on what you find important in a video game, right? Like, if you're the type of person who's just into dungeon crawlers, then you're not going to really have a problem with this because, you know, for the most part, you don't care about that. You just care about having interesting spaces to explore, run through, kill enemies, loot, stuff like that. And that's totally fine. I get it. But I value something different in my types of games. Like, I like for the place to tell a story. I like for when I walk into a room to understand what the purpose of that room was in relation to the entire building, so that I get a little more of a sense of how people use this space and live within it. That kind of stuff is really important to me. If that stuff isn't important to you, then just ignore everything I said. There's another delve here that's a mine shaft that's been invaded by Daedra, and it, again, is just a series of rooms connected by hallways, but these rooms actually attempt to look like real places. See how there's shelves full of barrels, mining equipment, cranes, a shrine with a statue in the middle of oily water? There's at least an attempt at building a believable space here, whereas the previous delve was just rooms, as I said before. But it wasn't enough to be memorable because it's a mine. We've already seen a million of these things, and this has done nothing to differentiate itself. And I could just chalk that up to, once you've seen one mine, you've seen them all. But here's the thing. I've played Nehrim, which is a total conversion mod for Oblivion made by the same people that made Enderall. There's a ton of mines in Nehrim, and each one of them looked and felt unique. And I still remember the layout and design of the very first dungeon you escape from in the beginning of that game, because it was so well designed and felt like a real space that it's burned into my memory. So it's possible to make an interesting mine, even with the materials you have on hand from someone else's engine. Just saying. My favorite delve was the one that took the more interesting themes of Elseweyr, the jungle environments, and repurposed them to create a believable underground space. This is one of the few delves that stood out to me, and I think a lot of that was due to the sheer scale of the place in some of the areas, and the uniqueness of the environmental assets. Then we come to the world bosses, and woo-wee, man, we gotta talk about this shit. Remember when I was saying that the world bosses of the Summerset Isles were really well designed and had some interesting mechanics and were actually cool looking and unique in a lot of ways, and that they were actually challenging and gave you a reason to team up with people to take them down? Well, it's the complete opposite for Elseweyr. Firstly, the bosses do utilize some mechanics that can be interesting. Well, one of them does. The rest, not so much. There's one world boss where you have to pick which area to stand in, and there's no rhyme or reason to why you would choose one over the other, and I never felt like I was really in any danger. But it was the most unique mechanic in the DLC, and I thought I would at least mention it, even though, as I said, it was pretty lame in practice. The other bosses, well, the other bosses are just dudes. Just a guy or a girl in armor that you wail on until they die. Some of them spawn in enemies to deal with, and only 2 of them are non-humanoids, and they're just harder versions of monsters you've already fought before, so not even the unique world bosses are unique. And unlike the previous world bosses from Summerset, I beat every one of these bosses without help, and for the most part, without breaking a sweat. So, like the delves, uninspired experience overall. Then there's the public dungeons, and well, I don't really have much to say about them. There's one dungeon that has you investigating a possible periite sickness that has spread through a town, but it's mostly just paths through a town fighting Daedra and I guess undead. I mean, it's a town, you walk through it and kill stuff. I don't really have much to say about it. The characters were okay, nothing to write home about. The quest was alright, nothing that made my hair stand up on end, just okay. Like so much of this DLC, to be honest. A step back in many ways from previous content with very little highs, very few lows, just all right. But the final public dungeon is a real weird one because it is actually really good. I liked it a lot. In fact, it works on a couple of different levels. First, let's tackle the use of space. You enter into the dungeon, grab the mission, which is rather bland. You grab an urn, drop it off at a place. It never arises from a simple grab and drop mission, but the background to the mission, the thing that is happening in the background, is that there's two factions of Daedra having themselves a little fight inside. And when you enter the huge, wide open main room at the center of the dungeon, you catch a glimpse of them off in a distance fighting one another. And what happens from there is you're dragged into a multi-phase battle with several enemies and multiple boss fights that actually managed to kill me my first time out, because I just wasn't prepared for it to be difficult at all. And it wasn't terribly difficult, but it was more difficult than what I was used to, and it caught me by complete surprise, which is a nice change of pace. Then you go through the dungeon and you spot all these undead and Daedra actually doing shit, you know, like they exist for some other reason than to wait for you to initiate combat with them. The dungeon actually tells a story, and it was a nice change of pace. Then there's the way that the dungeon actually uses all that space. In the wide open area, there's levels of elevation where there's space in the middle and space above, with stairs connecting the bottom, mid, and top regions of the dungeon. And these levels also connect to both the sides of the dungeon, so it makes traversal easy and fun. I'm a big fan of this dungeon. I wish more of the delves in Public Dungeon did these kinds of things, because it would make the prospect of doing them over and over again for reasons other than I need a piece of gear more likely to happen. The players might actually revisit it because it was fun. What a unique concept, huh? See, where the DLC is supposed to draw you in is with the dragons. I did a bunch of dragon fights. One solo, which I got completely wrecked on, and I never bothered trying to do that again. And then I did another with about 5 players, and it ended up being an easy fight. But then I started grinding dragons out, and you know what? They're actually pretty challenging because they have, once again, a ton of one-shot mechanics, and unless you're a tank, you're gonna have a bad time if you get hit. It all depends on how many people are helping you with the dragon and how quickly you can burn down that 16 million hit point health bar. The rewards are okay, I guess, but there are a couple of issues with this, and a lot of it comes back to my previous criticism. The further you are away from a dragon, the less chance you have of actually fighting it, because as I said before, the map has very few way shrines, so you end up having to hoof it to the dragon before it dies, and by the time I get there, 50% of the time the dragon was already dead, and the other 50% of the time he was already halfway dead. I never got to fight a dragon in a group from beginning to end because of how spread out everything is. After I did this activity for a day, I didn't see any need to grind the dragons out anymore, and I left it alone to focus on the story content. And that about covers it for the activity. Aside from the trial, of course, so we'll take a look at the story. The thing I started all those years back but never finished, and now I know why. First, let's start with the premise. Someone has brought all the dragons back to life. Sounds familiar. The dragons have teamed up with a dictator, and a band of rebels want to take back the throne and do away with the current queen and discover the reasons behind the dragons breaking free from their prison and stop their plot. Like Summerset, this plot moves very slowly. You start out by getting a summons to speak to Abner Tharn, a guy you've already met, and he gives you a job to do. He wants you to discover the source of magical surges that his magical surge detector has been picking up. And at each of these sites, there's wacky things afoot. And then at the final site, you find out that Cadwell, that guy you met before, he's digging up a grave looking for something called the Head of the Betrayer. And it would be a surprise to see him if Abner Tharn hadn't buried the lead earlier. After this, you head off to a camp to meet Abner, and the camp is under attack by a dragon, which he quickly swats away like a fly. From this point on, you go on a series of missions to rescue a cast of characters. Well, okay, not rescue so much as bring out of retirement, and there's nothing, at least until the halfway point of the story, that'll make you go, ooh, ah, wowee. There's plenty of moments where you think something cool is gonna happen, like when the queen sends supposedly an army to attack a town and you have to defend it, and what happens? There's like 4 dudes and a necromancer that teleports away. She sent an army of 4 people. The necromancer raises the dead, and overall the stakes never feel high because you can single-handedly handle everything she's thrown at you, let alone all the backup forces you've brought. Then a dragon attacks and you kill his ass quicker than some of the elite mobs in the game. Wow, man, I'm like sweating bullets over here, game. Slow down on the challenge, I don't think I can keep up. The story does get mildly interesting about halfway through for a moment, but then goes back to drudgery. I think the main problem is, aside from a notable exception with Cadwell, there's no characters in this DLC that I like at all. Abner is a pompous asshole, the Queen is a mustache-twirling villain, the Necromancer is another mustache-twirling villain, the dragons are also much the same as the other villains, and overall, I think this DLC's story suffers from the Spider-Man 3 problem of having too many one-dimensional villains that never get their time to shine and develop fully. I think they would have been better off focusing on just one villain, like combine all 3 of the villains into one character and further flesh out their needs and plans, and maybe even make their motivations sympathetic in some way, so the villain is, you know, interesting. But nothing is done here. It's just a story that jangles keys in front of your face and says, "Ooh, look, dragons! You like them in Skyrim? Now there's a dragon playing with kittens! How cute!" And while all this shit is going on, in the background, there's another rebellion happening that you also have to focus on. I'm sorry, but there's just way too many plot threads to focus on, and it takes focus away from the elements that could have been focused on and made more interesting. Instead, almost all the characters are cardboard cutouts, and I can't recall one interesting trait from any of them. Whereas, if you think about it, there was an arc for the previous stories that took their time and focused on a few important details. Like Morrowind, for instance. It focused on a Daedric prince's plot to destroy Vivek, and any character that was introduced was directly involved in that plot. Then we get the continuation of that plot in Clockwork City with another Daedric prince and another plot to destroy a god, and then in Summerset, when another Daedric prince is introduced to the plot, seeing all 3 princes from previous stories binding together to carry out their plans. There felt like, by the end of Summerset, like you had a history with these characters, a history that they recognize, and instead of trying to introduce a bunch of shit and wrap it up in one story arc, they took their time and had a 3-act structure for a story that stretched over the span of 3 DLCs in 3 years. Not only was this good for the story, it was also good for attachment, as they say in the industry. It brought customers back to see the continuation of the story, so it's a win-win for ZeniMax. By contrast, this story is constantly lore dumping in your lap, introducing multiple important characters and dispatching with them just as quickly, and by the end, nothing feels like it mattered at all. But as much as I can complain about the story, the final fight at the end of the story is so good and is an example of what I was talking about in my original video about wanting the bosses in the vanilla game to be. It's challenging, the boss can kill you if you don't engage with the mechanics, and it reminds me of the bosses in dungeons. By comparison, the fight with Molag Bal at the end of the vanilla game was a joke. Anyway, this is probably the first DLC in the series of DLCs that I've played where I can honestly say you could skip the story because it doesn't expand on previously established lore in any serious way, and the story is not compelling enough to recommend. But that's not why people buy these DLCs, right? I mean, part of why they buy them is the items. So how are the items in Elseweyr? Call of the Undertaker is an interesting set. It caught my eye the minute I started doing the world bosses because of its obvious uses as a tank set, but it's let down by the fact that a level 1 Undaunted skill replaces completely the need for a 5-piece item set. If the lifesteal was higher, it probably would be more useful, but it might be useful in a build where you only have one 5-piece bonus, a 2-piece monster set, and an artifact item. Claw of Yolnara, whatever the fuck, Claw of Yolnakrin? Claw of Yolnakrin is an awesome dungeon set. It doesn't look like much, but it has a 100% uptime on minor courage, which will give you and your entire team a substantial buff to weapon and spell damage, which, in a trial, is a couple thousand extra damage spread throughout your team. Crafty Elite is a set that you pick if you look at your magicka and say, I don't have enough magicka. It's good if you want a massive pool of resources and want to do insane amounts of damage. False God's Devotion looks like a good set for solo DPS magicka players who want good resource sustain. Overall, there's some interesting sets and some that didn't really catch my attention, but from everything I've read, Claw of Yolnakrin is a must-have for group content. And that's about all I've got to say about this DLC. It was honestly pretty forgettable, and I did enjoy the one public dungeon as well as one of the delves. It all just feels like a really underwhelming package. Now we gotta talk about the DLC that I feel like is probably the most controversial, I don't know, because this zone of Elseweyr is split up into two zones, Northern Elseweyr and Southern Elseweyr. But the DLC for the one I just did, is called Elseweyr. So when you buy it, you're thinking to yourself, I'm getting all of Elseweyr, but you're not. You have to buy this one separate. So let's talk about the Southern Elseweyr DLC, Dragonhold. Dragonhold is unique in that it's probably the least unique DLC in the whole group. The beaches are just like the beaches in most of the other maps. The inland is simply grasslands, and the enemies you find here are reskins from Murkmire and other DLCs, or just straight up repurposed. Where the map does get a little more interesting is in its verticality. The stone formations and some of the ruins. For instance, there's a delve that looks like the entrance is this big gate over a bridge, but you find out that the castle is blocked, and you have to follow this wood plank bridge leading to a cave entrance. The delve is fairly large and interesting to explore, but again, like Murkmire and Clockwork, there's only two of them, and only one of them is any good in my opinion. And then you got the world bosses, and just like Elseweyr, they're dog shit. They're uninspired. One is a reused enemy type, the other is a tall Khajiit. Both of them are soloable, and one of them is so easy, they might as well just have been a trash mob. This has to be the worst world bosses in the game, hands down, at least so far. Then there's the dragons. You know, I like them, just like I like them in the previous DLC. They use different elements, but their attack patterns are exactly the same, no matter their type, so it doesn't do anything to spice up those encounters. At least the arenas that these fights happen in from time to time are nice looking, but that's about all I have to say about them. Once you've done them a few times, you learn their patterns, and they're no longer a challenge. So by the time you finish the first Elseweyr expansion, and then get to this one, there'll be no challenge to you, and you'll have no reason to do them. So they're just added in there because it was an easy way to add content to an otherwise underwhelming DLC. At least the vistas were nice to look at from time to time, and that's it. Like, this has to be a record for how quickly I'm done talking about the activities in a DLC. I mean, the content really is that thin. And it was here that I started to notice something that I especially don't like about these DLCs. The lack of content hinders these smaller DLCs in more than just the hours of content metric, but in other ways. Primarily when grinding out gear in these areas. See, when grinding out levels in, say, Alakir Desert, you typically want to do the dolmen rotation where you just constantly teleport from one way shrine to another doing dolmens, grinding jewelry, jeweler levels, and character levels at the same time, and repeating it over and over until you die of boredom. There's no downtime to this grinding because by the time you finish the final dolmen in the rotation, the first dolmen is back up and ready to be done. It's quick, it's easy, and has zero downtime. Great for grinding out gear sets, right? The same can be done with delves and world bosses if you have a good group, or you just know the fastest route to these places. But in these smaller DLCs, by the time, for instance, you finish one delve, the other delve boss may have already been spawned and killed by another player because there's only 2 of them, and they are spread out fairly far away from the way shrines, which makes grinding out gear sets more difficult when you have fewer chances in the map to get that gear to drop. When you only have 2 delves, that's only 2 chances per 10 minutes with a higher chance of downtime. Whereas on a 6 delve map, you might get 3 chances every 10 minutes if you have good routes and you know the shortest path to the boss, but on a map with only 2 world bosses and 2 delve bosses and no public dungeons, your options are fairly limited. So you may end up having significant downtime to your gear grinding, and given how the grind in this game works, that could be a real problem if you need an overland set from one of these smaller DLCs. Your mileage will vary, of course, on how important this is. It's just something that I thought I should mention. Then there's something that I don't think gets enough mentions because it's maybe something that most people don't notice. Firstly, new DLCs usually come with new furnishing styles and plans, but this one just reuses the Northern Elseweyr stuff as well as carrying over the dragon events from the last DLC. It doesn't come with any significant PvE stuff like Murkmire did, or Orsinium with the arenas, or the trials of other expansions. It does come with the Dragon Guard dailies, but I can hardly call that a draw. It just feels like this DLC was rushed out and very little effort was put into making Southern Elseweyr feel different from Northern Elseweyr, which begs the question, why did they break these zones up into 2 different DLCs if Southern Elseweyr was just gonna look like a reskinned area from another DLC? I mean, everything from the architecture of the ruins and the city, to the landscapes and statues, to the monster types that are carried over in some way from other DLCs, there's hardly anything new here. And despite all this, I actually liked exploring the area. I think it was because it used a more refined version of the linear but open design in a way where, sure, I was blocked off a certain area by high cliff faces, but the way up was obvious and I never felt terribly put out by having to go around. Very much unlike the Summerset design, which was abysmal. With all my gripes, I can still admit that I enjoyed exploring the area for the terribly short time that I did explore it. Once I got most of the objectives in the maps, there wasn't a reason to go back to it because there's a severe lack of content in this DLC. Then we come to the story. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but every DLC, the small ones at least, have declined in the number of story quests that get included with each subsequent release. Clockwork City had 8 missions, Murkmire had 7, and Dragonhold has a measly 6. So the quantity seems to be diminishing, in my opinion, and only my opinion, because it seems that whenever I look up other opinions on Elseweyr and Murkmire, it's all effusive praise, and I personally don't get it. Maybe I'm just not seeing what they're seeing, but it really does feel like that. Right around this time, things started falling apart. And I think there's an elegant way of explaining why I am feeling this way in particular. See, these stories, even the stories that they told in the vanilla games, all of ESO's stories follow a formula. And they don't just follow a formula, they follow it so slavishly that the story beats and the plot start to become so predictable that you can tell who's going to do what by which point in the story. I started to notice this trend in Murkmire, and by the time I got to Dragonhold, I decided to try something different. I wanted to see if my theory was correct, that all these stories follow this trend and that I could predict the plot points within reason. Here's how this formula goes. And before we go any further, this is spoiler territory, so skip ahead if you don't want any of these DLCs spoiled. Okay? Alright, here we go. The story usually starts off with a problem, as most stories do. This is a pretty standard thing, so I won't explain it too much. Suffice to say, the sooner a story introduces the problem, the better. The problem usually results in a devastating result if something isn't done about it. Orsinium falling due to a lack of supplies, Morrowind being destroyed by Bardau, Clockwork City being destroyed by Nocturnal, the whole of Nirn falling to Nocturnal in Summerset, and so on. Then at some point in the story, someone reveals that they aren't who you think they are. This is trope number 1. ZeniMax stories always do this to the point where it gets to be predictable. In Orsinium, the Orc King betrays the warlords. In Morrowind, the Archcanon turns out to be Barbas. In Clockwork City, Sothasil is a shadow. In Summerset Isle, Aldark Tilkar turns out to be a cultist. In Murkmire, Cassandra turns out to be working with the mercenaries. In Elseweyr, Chimera turns out to be the rightful heir to the throne. And in Dragonhold, the dragon you go to the island and kill turns out to be a good guy. If one of your allies turns out to be something different, but still good, it happens near the beginning of the story. If it turns out that they're bad, it happens near the end, usually. That's the twist. So what ends up happening is, if one of your characters hasn't turned on you yet, and you haven't been introduced to somebody who isn't who you think they are, by the end of the game, you're going to be able to predict almost within 100% degree of certainty who is going to turn on you and at what point in the story they're going to do it. The next story trope is the team must seek out a MacGuffin that either the enemy wants or will destroy the enemy. In Orsinium, it's the supplies that were stolen. In Morrowind, it's the Staff of Sun Ra. In Clockwork City, it's the Dwemer Key. Summerset, it's the Crystal. In Murkmire, it's the Staff and the Soul Egg. In Elseweyr, it's the Horn. And in Dragonhold, it's the Mask. Then there's the investigative period. Where is the MacGuffin and how do we find it? In Orsinium, you have to track down a trader and get him to give you the location of the supplies. In Morrowind, you have to go to several locations and ask around about odd occurrences. In Clockwork City, you have to contact the Court of Crows and convince them to give you a key. In Summerset, you have to restore to Sigic's memories so he can remember where he put the crystal. In Murkmire, you have to journey into the memories of an Argonian warrior. In Elseweyr, you have to find Zamorak. And in Dragonhold, you have to use the bells in a temple to point the way and have Mother Tadali tell you where it is. And then you use this item in some way to save the day. And I think that's the reason why when I got this DLC, I had enough of these stories. Because I predicted the dragon was going to be friendly, I knew we were going to have to track down a MacGuffin, and I would use that MacGuffin to stop a threat, and it played out in front of me by the numbers, and by the time I got to Murkmire, I had seen every trick that this game had up its sleeve. See, the story structure was fine in Morrowind, Clockwork City, and Summerset because there was so much else going on for those stories. The characters were strong, there were funny moments in Clockwork City, the areas were unique enough to be compelling, there was a lot going on in those DLCs. But by the time Murkmire came around, the DLCs were starting to lose steam. Dragonhold does have, well, one character that's fun to be around, and he made most of the other stuff at least tolerable, but like I said, by this point, the formula became predictable, and I was no longer surprised by anything the game was trying to show me. After you beat the final boss at the end of the story, there's another storyline that starts up that combines both the story of Elseweyr with the story of Dragonhold, and this I was not expecting. It was actually pretty good and a satisfying way to wrap up the story, and overall, if you liked Elseweyr, then you should definitely check out this DLC to get the closure. I said that I would like to update you at the end of the video about some things I said I wasn't going to know until I had pumped another 100 hours into the game. Well, here we are, 100 hours later, and yes, I have found a ton of racial style books, mostly duplicates, but yes, I have found many, but I still have only found one page from one unique style, and I search every vase, barrel, bag, backpack, etc. when I go into a dungeon, or just when I'm exploring the world. I searched them all, and I still only found one page. So I wouldn't call that a stellar drop rate, seeing as how I did all the content of 5 DLCs, actually 7 DLCs, maybe 8? How many did I do? I don't even know. So my criticism remains. I hate the drop rate, and I hate the pricing. I didn't think my opinion would change, and here we are. Trials. I said that I would try to do some trials, and I did. I swear to you, I really tried to do them, but I was unsuccessful. I even petitioned on Twitter for some help recruiting people for trials. Not only was there no one on Twitter that played ESO or trials, but Zarek Zakarian, an Elder Scrolls YouTuber, tried to talk to his old guildmates, who he claimed were no-lifers, to see if they would help, and both of his old guilds were no longer around and had completely dropped the game. Then I was left with only one choice: guilds. So this is a funny story and requires a bit of background. Guilds in ESO are different than guilds from other games that I'm used to. First, a lot of guilds in ESO have certain requirements. Some guilds require you to be a certain champion level before joining. Other guilds have an activity requirement, meaning you have to put a certain amount of hours in every week to join and stay in a guild. Then there are other guilds that charge you guild dues to pay for guild merchants because ESO makes you pay for your merchants. You know, like rent. And to join any of these guilds, you have to put in an application. If it sounds like you're applying for a job, it's because it's quite similar. You have to work a certain amount of hours per week, have a certain amount of on-the-job experience, and you have to pay union dues. It's like a friggin' job, no doubt. So I put an application into 3 guilds at first. All 3 of these guilds were supposedly active in doing trials. I waited for a couple of days for my first response, and I was turned down by the first guild. A week later, I was turned down by the second. Finally got accepted by the 3rd guild, and I was excited, but I shouldn't have been, because the guild chat was dead, and when I finally tracked down their Discord channel, found out that the Discord channel was dead as well. I posted about doing trials in their request channel, and yeah, as you can imagine, I got nothing. Then I tracked down a feature I didn't know about, Group Finder. It's like the Activity Finder, but for getting a group for specific activities, so you could apply for a group that has already started for trials or arenas. So I looked up groups for trials for 3 straight days, and the first 2 days I couldn't find a single group doing a trial. The 3rd day, there were 2 groups, but neither of them were doing the trials I needed to do. And when I started my own group, I waited an hour and a half without so much as a single request to join. So I started doing some research. And this is the problem. As far as I can tell, at some point, trials became very exclusionary for new players. Apparently, you can't even get into a pug group if you don't have the achievement for finishing a trial. And you can't get the achievement unless you finished a trial. So this is another way that doing trials and being in a guild is like getting a job. You can't get a job without experience, and you can't get experience without a job. Dog, this is dumb as shit. Like, one of the biggest problems this game has is that it can't keep players interested in the end game. And how can you keep players for the end game if getting into the end game activities is this difficult? I started shouting in Zone to see if I could get a group for a trial, and I found out very quickly that no, I can't do that. So long story short, I would need to do another video dedicated to the trials because, to be honest, my build isn't going to be good enough for vet trials anyway, at least not for the DLC trials, and I would need to grind out trial gear before even getting seriously considered to do them. Then there's the DLC classes. I had access to 2 of them, the Warden and the Necromancer. I started a Warden and a Necro, so I'll start talking about the Warden first. I like this class for the pets and the bear ultimate. I like the idea that you don't use your ultimate so much as you summon a pet and set and forget. As far as I could tell, Wardens were a pretty shit class at first. They had good survivability and terrible damage, and at some point in 2022 they got a buff and became a better damage class. I like the animal themed abilities. Summoning classes can be hit or miss for me, but this one doesn't really rely on others doing damage for you, and you are still easily capable of doing damage. Warden is slowly becoming my go-to class for grinding, and I think it might end up being my DPS character for dungeons when I max it out. I find the Necromancer to be a really fun class to play, but it also has a really high skill ceiling and probably plays the most different from other classes. I somehow, regardless of that, managed to get some of the highest DPS numbers on a character that is, as of writing this, so low level. You know, I've heard that this class goes off when you have a really good player behind it, but if you screw up your ability rotations, it really stinks. So if you're a veteran player looking for something different that requires all your skill to play, this could be an interesting class to play. Though I feel like I need a lot more time with this class before I can give a solid recommendation, especially since the Arcanist has been released, and from what I've heard, that class is OP, which doesn't surprise me if true, because that seems to be what most companies do when they release a new class or a new character in order to entice people to buy them. Then they later nerf the class after it's been out for a while and people stop buying it. You know, so how do I feel about the DLC content I played so far? I'm pretty impressed, to be honest. Even the DLCs I didn't enjoy that much were still pretty good in ways that didn't totally make me regret my time with them. All in all, I really enjoyed my time with these expansions, especially Clockwork City. play, and I would highly recommend just getting ESO Plus and running through the content in a couple of months. And if you decide to stick around for the end game content, great. So as far as what's next, I honestly didn't know, but then I was thinking about Batman because I had just read the Batgirl New 52 Gail Simone run with the Joker, and I was like, man, you know what I want to play? I want to play Batman. So I've already written the video for Arkham Asylum. It's over 20,000 words. It's as long as the original ESO video. So that'll be out pretty soon. And if you know, I get enough views, if I can sustain my livelihood, I will do Arkham City, Arkham Origins, and Arkham Knight. And then maybe Gotham Knight. You know what I mean? That game, yeah. And maybe after that, I'll do Suicide Squad, huh? Wouldn't that be fun? That would be fun. All right, so anyway, that's it, man. So thanks for sticking around. And as usual, this has been a rant from Strat-Edgy. And now that you heard it, go play some games.